She fired him at 7:43 in the morning. Didn't ask his name. Didn't ask why he was there. Didn't ask why every monitor around him was lit up red and why his hands, even as security gripped his arms, were still reaching back toward the keyboard like a man trying to stop a dam from breaking with his bare fingers. She just pointed and said, "Get him out." And they did. What Victoria Hale didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Ethan Cross had been awake for 48 hours holding the entire company together by sheer will and 17 lines of temporary code. And the moment they walked him out that door, the clock started. If this story already has you gripped, hit that like button right now, drop your city in the comments below so I can see just how far this story travels. And stay with me until the very end, because what happens next will change the way you think about the people you overlook every single day. The elevator doors opened on the 14th floor at 6:51 in the morning, and Victoria Hale stepped out into a building that still smelled like last night's cleaning crew. She'd wanted it that way. She had specifically asked her assistant, the young man named Drew, who wore the same nervous expression every day and wrote everything down in a paper notebook like a student afraid to forget the homework. She had asked him to schedule her arrival for before 7, before the staff, before the coffee carts and the badge tap lines, and the performance of everyone trying to look busy the moment they noticed the new CEO had walked in. She wanted to see the place when it was honest. Titan Core Financial Systems occupied 4 full floors of a glass tower in downtown Chicago, and from the outside it looked like exactly what it was: money. Serious, institutional, intractable money. The kind of company that processed more than $600 million in business-to-business payments every single day, quietly and invisibly, through a network so deeply embedded in the financial infrastructure of the Midwest that most of the companies who used it didn't even know they were using it. Titan Core was the plumbing, and like most plumbing, nobody thought about it until something went wrong. Victoria had been hired to make sure nothing went wrong. She was 30 years old, the youngest CEO in the company's 32-year history, the only woman. She had spent the last 8 years doing operational turnarounds at 2 mid-size financial tech firms, the kind of unglamorous work that involved spreadsheets and difficult conversations, and occasionally telling people with 20 years of experience that the way they'd always done things wasn't working anymore. She was good at it. She was methodical and direct, and she didn't need people to like her, which was useful, because in her experience, people rarely liked the person who came in to fix things. She wore her dark hair pulled back this morning. She had on a charcoal blazer over a white shirt, no jewelry except a thin watch, flat shoes because she intended to walk the whole building, and heels on a tour like this were a vanity she couldn't afford. She carried a legal pad and a pen. She had already filled 3 pages before leaving her apartment at 5:30. The 14th floor was where the finance and accounts team sat, and it was empty now except for the overnight cleaning staff finishing up near the far windows. Victoria walked through it slowly, running her hand along the edge of a desk, reading the names on the little plaques outside the cluster offices, noting the stack of papers on one desk that suggested someone who never actually went home on time, the half-dead plant in the corner that had been ignored for what looked like months. She wrote, "Plant in southeast corner. Nobody's job. Signs of unclear ownership throughout." She took the stairs to 15. Marketing, communications, 2 conference rooms with whiteboards that still had diagrams from what looked like a meeting from 3 weeks ago. She photographed them with her phone without quite knowing why. Evidence of something. She didn't know what yet. She took the stairs to 16. Executive suite, her office, the boardroom with its long walnut table and the framed photos of every previous CEO, 7 men, arranged in chronological order along one wall. She stood in front of them for a moment, not out of sentimentality. She was trying to read something in their faces, what they'd prioritized, what they'd missed. Then she took the stairs to 17, the operations center. This was the floor she'd been most interested in seeing. It was the nerve center of Titan Core's payment infrastructure, the room where the technical teams monitored the network in real time, where the alerts came in, where the decisions got made when something started to go sideways. She had read the floor's staffing reports on the plane from New York 2 days ago. 17 people worked across 3 rotating shifts. The overnight shift ran with a skeleton crew of 3, sometimes 4. Daytime ramped up to the full complement by 8. It was not quite 7 when she pushed open the door to the operations center, and what she found was not what she expected. She expected the room to feel like a control room, calm, lit, purposeful. She expected the overnight crew to be at their stations, monitoring their dashboards, doing whatever it was they did through the quiet hours. Instead, the room felt like the aftermath of something. Monitors were lit up everywhere, not with the clean green dashboard she'd seen in the briefing materials, but with dense cascades of text and data readouts and what looked like network topology maps with portions highlighted in amber and red. Someone had pushed 2 chairs aside to drag a secondary monitor closer to one workstation. There were 3 empty energy drink cans on the floor beside the desk and a 4th one crushed in the trash bin. An empty foil wrapper from what might have been a granola bar was flattened against the keyboard rest. There were handwritten notes on what appeared to be about 20 sticky notes spread across the edge of the monitor stand and partially taped to the desk itself. And at the center of all of it, slumped sideways in the chair, was a man asleep. He was maybe 35. He had dark hair that needed a cut and a jawline covered in 2 or 3 days of stubble. He was wearing what might have once been a clean button-down shirt, navy blue, now wrinkled past the point of pretending. His right hand had fallen from the keyboard to rest against his thigh. His left hand was loosely curled near the mouse, like even in sleep his body was still trying to hold its position. There was no one else in the room. Victoria stood in the doorway for a moment. She felt the heat of the servers around her and heard the low mechanical hum that never went away on this floor. And she looked at this man, this employee, asleep at a workstation on her first day, and she felt something harden in her chest. This was, she thought, exactly the kind of thing she'd been hired to address. She'd read the culture reports. She'd read the exit interviews from the last 2 years. She knew the reputation. TitanCore was a company where accountability had atrophied, where people did the minimum because doing more didn't seem to get noticed, where the wrong people had been allowed to coast while the good ones got burned out and left. The board had been explicit with her: change the culture, tighten the ship, make TitanCore the kind of company that runs like it means it. She thought about the plant on the 14th floor. She thought about the whiteboard diagrams that had been left for 3 weeks without anyone erasing them. She thought about the 7 men on the wall downstairs and the way this company had drifted from what it should have been. She walked across the room. "Hey," she said. The man didn't move. "Hey." Louder. He startled awake in the uncoordinated, panicked way of someone who had been truly, deeply asleep, arms coming up, head jerking, one hand flying to the keyboard by reflex before he even had his eyes open. His chair rolled back 6 inches, and he caught himself against the desk edge and blinked at her. "What?" he said. Then his eyes focused. Then he seemed to realize who he was looking at, or at least what he was looking at. A woman in a blazer he didn't recognize, standing in the operations center at 7 in the morning with a legal pad and an expression that was not warm. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice was wrecked, the voice of someone who had been running on no sleep and too much caffeine for a long time. I didn't mean to." "What's your name?" Victoria said. "Ethan Cross. I'm the senior infrastructure specialist on the—" "How long have you been asleep, Mr. Cross?" He blinked. He looked at the monitors, then at the clock on the wall, and something moved across his face. Not guilt exactly, but something closer to the look of a man trying to do a rapid calculation while still not fully awake. "Maybe 30 minutes, he said. "Maybe less. I've been here a while. There was a situation I was managing and I must have dropped off." "A situation?" "Yes. In the network, there's a—" He stopped. He glanced at the monitors again, and she saw his expression change, sharpen, the sleep burning off him with sudden urgency. "Is anyone else on the floor? Is there someone from the infrastructure team?" "Mr. Cross." He looked at her. "I want you to hear me clearly," Victoria said. "I am Victoria Hale. I am the new CEO of this company, and this is my first morning in this building. And the first thing I found when I came to see the operations center at 7 o'clock was an employee asleep at his workstation." He opened his mouth. "I'm not finished," she said. "I understand that people have different schedules, different situations, different reasons for the choices they make. But what I am looking at right now tells me everything I need to know about the culture that exists in this building. And I was hired to change that culture. So I'm going to ask you to gather your things." A very long silence. "You're firing me," Ethan said. It wasn't a question. His voice had gone flat in a way that was harder to read than anger or hurt would have been. I'm asking you to collect your belongings and go to HR. He looked at her for a moment, just looked at her, and there was something in his face she couldn't quite parse. Not desperation, not the please give me a chance expression she'd braced for. He looked, she would think later, like a man standing at the edge of something and trying to decide how to explain the ledge to someone who couldn't see it. I've been here for 48 hours, he said. I need you to know that. I have been in this room for 48 hours because there is something wrong with the payment network, and I have been... Mr. Cross, I need you to listen to me for 60 seconds. His voice didn't rise. That was the thing she would remember. He didn't plead or raise his voice or make it emotional. He said it with the gravity of someone who already knew he wasn't going to be heard, but was going to say it anyway. There is an active intrusion in the network routing layer. I've been managing containment manually since Tuesday night because it's sophisticated enough that the standard monitoring didn't flag it correctly, and the patches I've put in place are temporary. They are not permanent. They are holding the network together right now, but they will not survive a full system restart. And if someone restarts the core services before I can implement the... Security, Victoria said. She had seen the call panel near the door when she walked in. She had pressed the button for building security, almost without deciding to, because the conversation had reached the point where she needed it to end. 2 men arrived within 3 minutes. They were professional and not unkind. They asked Ethan Cross to come with them, and he stood up slowly, like a man whose body had forgotten how to move without effort, and he gathered nothing. There was nothing to gather, apparently. No jacket, no bag, just the man himself and the ruins of his long night arranged across the workstation in front of him. At the door, he stopped. He turned around and looked back at the room, at the monitors, at the notes he'd written, at everything still glowing and amber and waiting, and then he looked at Victoria. Whatever happens, he said, do not restart the system. Then security walked him out, and the door fell shut behind them, and Victoria stood alone in the operations center with the hum of the servers and all those amber warnings she didn't know how to read. She told herself, walking back down to 16, that it had been the right call. The logic was clean. She had been hired to establish a new standard. She had discovered a violation of basic professional conduct. She had addressed it immediately, clearly, and without making it personal. This was exactly what changing a culture looked like. It looked uncomfortable, and it looked swift, and it looked like doing the thing people had been afraid to do for years. She told herself this. She sat down at her desk and opened her laptop and pulled up the briefing documents she'd been working through for the past week. The network architecture overview, the transaction volume reports, the security assessment from 8 months ago, the last one that had been completed, she noted, before a follow-up was meant to be scheduled and apparently never was. She began reading. Her coffee arrived at 7:30, brought by Drew, who also brought a printed copy of her morning schedule. She had a 9 o'clock with the department heads, an 11 o'clock with the board liaison, a lunch with the CFO that was almost certainly going to be awkward because the CFO, a man named Gerald Stanton, who had been with Titan Core for 14 years, had wanted the CEO role himself and had made sure everyone knew it. At 8:15, her phone rang. It was the head of IT operations, a woman named Sandra Park, who had a voice that suggested she was already 3 steps into managing something difficult. Ms. Hale, Sandra said, I just heard about what happened this morning with Ethan Cross. I wanted to... I'm aware of what happened, Victoria said. It's been handled. A beat. Right. I understand. I wanted to flag that Ethan had filed a security notification with my office on Tuesday evening. I hadn't fully reviewed it yet, but given what you found this morning, I think there might be... Sandra, I have a full morning. Can we schedule time this afternoon to go through any outstanding notifications from the infrastructure team? Another pause, slightly longer. Of course. Yes. I'll have my assistant reach out. Thank you. She hung up and went back to her briefing documents. The department head meeting at 9 went the way those meetings always went when a new leader arrived. Everyone was careful. Everyone was watching. Everyone was performing a version of themselves they thought would land well with someone new. She had been in enough of these rooms to recognize the performance. The operations director, a big soft-spoken man named Mark Hensley, kept nodding at everything she said, even when she hadn't finished saying it yet. The finance director, a woman named Claire Osei, took notes with the focused precision of someone who had decided that visible diligence was the safest posture for now. Gerald Stanton sat at the far end of the table and said very little, which was more disconcerting than if he'd said a lot. Victoria ran through her priorities. Culture accountability, infrastructure investment, client relationship stabilization after what she'd been told was a rocky Q3. She was direct, unhurried, and she asked questions that were genuine rather than rhetorical, which seemed to throw some of them off balance. She did not mention Ethan Cross. At 10:40, while she was walking back from the boardroom with Drew, her phone lit up with a message from Sandra Park. Some unusual readings in the network. Nothing alarming yet, but I've got my team looking at it. We'll update you. Victoria read the message twice. Then she put the phone in her pocket and went to her 11 o'clock. The first real alarm came at 12:17. She was in the middle of lunch with Gerald Stanton, who had spent the first 40 minutes of the meal being relentlessly pleasant in the way that people are relentlessly pleasant when they are deciding whether or not to trust you, when her phone began buzzing in a pattern that was different from the normal cadence of messages. Not once or twice, continuously. She excused herself from the table. The first text was from Sandra Park, then one from Mark Hensley, then one from the number she'd been given for the operations center overnight line, which shouldn't have been active at noon. She walked out of the restaurant and stood on the sidewalk in the November wind and read them in order. Sandra, network latency spiking in the routing layer. I'm on the floor now. Mark, Ms. Hale, we have a developing situation. Need you back at the building when possible. Operations line. Transaction routing is behaving erratically. Payments not confirming. Team is assessing. Victoria was back in the building in 11 minutes. Though the 14th floor, which had been quiet and orderly that morning, was now a different kind of place. People were clustered around monitors. The phones were ringing, not the ambient professional ringing of a normal afternoon, but the relentless stacking ring of calls that weren't being answered fast enough. Someone had brought up a whiteboard in the middle of the open floor and was writing numbers on it that Victoria didn't yet understand. 3 people stood around it arguing in the careful, controlled voices of people who were keeping themselves from shouting. Sandra Park met her at the elevator. Sandra was in her mid-40s, Korean-American, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a lanyard around her neck that held a collection of access cards that suggested she had spent years requiring access to places most people didn't go. She was one of those people who radiated competence without needing to announce it, and right now she looked like someone who had opened a door and found something worse than she'd expected on the other side. "Walk with me," Sandra said. They walked toward the operations center. "What are we looking at?" Victoria asked. "Transaction delays across multiple corridors. We're seeing payment packets that are not arriving at their destinations. As of about 15 minutes ago, we have approximately $40 million worth of confirmed transactions in state we'd call. Limbo isn't a technical term, but it's accurate. They went out. We can see they went out. But they're not arriving." Victoria kept her face neutral. "What's causing it?" Sandra took a breath. "That's what I want to show you." They went to a smaller room off the main operations floor. A room that functioned as something between a war room and a server closet, crowded with monitors and smelling strongly of the overworked machines that lined its walls. 2 engineers were there, young men named Dale and Kevin, who both had the expression of people who had just been handed a test they hadn't studied for. "Tell her what you found," Sandra said. Dale, who was the younger of the two and clearly the more anxious, pulled up a network diagram on the largest monitor. It was dense with labels and interconnecting lines, and several sections of it were highlighted in a deep red that was obviously not the default color. "So," Dale said, "when we started seeing the latency spike, we ran a standard diagnostic. What we found was, okay, so in the routing layer, which is the part of the network that actually decides where a payment goes before it gets sent out, there are these insertion points, like junctions. And what we're seeing is that some of those junctions are directing traffic to endpoints that they're not our endpoints. They don't belong to us. And we can't figure out where they came from." Victoria looked at the red sections on the map. "Someone put them there," she said. "Yes." How long have they been there? Dale and Kevin exchanged a look. We don't know, Kevin said. We're still trying to determine that. The insertion methodology it's pretty sophisticated. It's not the kind of thing that would show up in a normal audit. And our monitoring was configured to look for a different threat profile, so it wasn't flagging this correctly. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Ethan Cross filed a security notification Tuesday night, she said. Sandra nodded. He did. Did anyone read it? A silence that answered the question. What does the notification say? Victoria asked. Sandra reached over and brought up a different window. The notification was dense, 5 pages of technical description, formatted in the kind of careful, methodical way that suggested the person who wrote it knew they were writing for people who might not immediately understand the urgency and was trying to bridge that gap. At the top, in the subject line, Ethan had written, critical, active infiltration and payment routing layers, immediate attention required. Victoria read the first 2 pages while standing. He knew, she said. He knew Tuesday night, Sandra said. He's been managing it manually. The safeguards he put in place, they were keeping it contained, preventing the malicious routing entries from fully activating. Victoria looked up. We restarted the core services at 11:50, Sandra said. Standard protocol when we see performance anomalies. It was authorized by Mark Hensley's team. She paused. The restart wiped Ethan's patches. The room was very quiet for a moment. He warned us, Dale said quietly, apparently to no one in particular. I know, Sandra said. Victoria put her hand flat on the desk in front of her, just to have something solid under her palm. Get me his notes, she said. Everything he left at that workstation, every sticky note, every document, every file on that machine. I want it all. They brought it to her in the boardroom. Not digitally. Sandra had physically collected the notes from the workstation and brought them in a folder, and someone had also pulled the files from Ethan's machine onto a USB drive that Dale now plugged into the boardroom's display system. Victoria sat at the head of the table, alone except for Sandra, and they went through it. The sticky notes first, 23 of them. They were not random. Ethan had organized them in a system that made sense once you understood it, color-coded by priority. Yellow for monitoring status, orange for patch implementation notes, red for warnings. 3 of the red ones were stuck directly above the keyboard in a row. Victoria read them in order. The first said, do not restart core services. Patches are temporary and will not survive restart. Intrusion will activate. The second said, backdoor and routing junction R7 through R12, isolated but not neutralized. Do not disturb. The third said, if this fails, the attack vector was inserted approximately 11 days ago via the legacy FTP integration. Start there. Victoria read the third one twice. Then she read the files. Ethan had been meticulous. He had created a folder on his workstation called simply Security, and inside it were 47 files arranged by date and time, starting last Tuesday evening and continuing through entries that had timestamps of 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning, 6:30. The last file had been created at 6:42, 12 minutes before Victoria had walked into the operations center. She opened the last file. It was 3 pages long. It was addressed, in the header, to whoever finds this. I've been here for 2 days trying to contain this without raising a full alarm, because a full alarm would have triggered the protocol restart that will destroy everything I've built. I know that sounds backwards. Staying quiet to prevent the alert that would cause the damage I'm trying to prevent. It's not a comfortable position. But the attack is sophisticated, and the people who wrote it knew our response playbook. The restart is in the playbook. The patches I've implemented are holding as of 6:30 a.m. Wednesday. They're not elegant solutions. They're the equivalent of putting your finger in a hole in a dam. They will hold as long as nobody touches the dam. If you're reading this and the system has already been restarted, I'm sorry. I tried to document everything clearly enough that someone could follow it. Start with the R7 junction. The backdoor the attackers installed routes approximately 6 to 8% of transactions to a cascade of external endpoints before sending them to their actual destination, which means the payments appear to go through from our side but don't fully arrive. The cascade endpoints are the key. If you can find those addresses, and block them at the firewall level, and then manually reroute the affected transactions, you can recover most of what was diverted. It will take hours. Please don't lose the money. A lot of small businesses depend on this network. The last line of the document was, "I really didn't want to have to leave this note." Victoria closed the file. She sat in the boardroom for a minute without saying anything. Then she said, "I need his home address." Sandra looked at her. "I can get it from HR." "Get it." She drove herself. She didn't tell Drew, didn't take a car service, just got the address from Sandra, got the keys to the company fleet car from the parking attendant downstairs, and drove. Ethan Cross lived 22 minutes from the Titan Core building in a neighborhood that was in the process of deciding whether it was going up or staying flat. Older brick apartment buildings next to a new coffee place next to a hardware store that had clearly been there since before Victoria was born. His building was a 4-story walk-up, no doorman. The lobby had a bulletin board with flyers for lost cats and a guitar teacher and a community board meeting from October. She took the stairs. 3rd floor. She stood outside apartment 3C for a moment. She knocked. Nothing. She knocked again, harder. From inside, she heard movement, then a small voice, a child's voice, saying something she couldn't make out through the door. Then a man's voice, lower, and the particular fatigue in it was audible even through 2 inches of wood. The door opened. He was in sweatpants and a gray t-shirt. His feet were bare. He had clearly just been woken up. His eyes had the heavy, unfocused quality of someone who had fallen into the kind of sleep that the body demands when it's been denied too long. And for a moment, he just looked at her without saying anything. Standing behind him, half hidden by his leg, was a little girl. She was maybe 4, maybe 5. She had her father's dark hair, and she was wearing pajamas with small yellow stars on them, and she was looking at Victoria with the frank, unguarded curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned to perform indifference. She had a stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. "Hi," the girl said. "Hi," Victoria said. Ethan Cross said nothing. He just looked at her with the flat, exhausted look of a man who had spent 48 hours doing everything right and still lost. And now the person responsible for that loss was standing in his doorway, and he was too tired to arrange his face into anything diplomatic. "I read your notes," Victoria said. He waited. "All of them. The files, the sticky notes, the letter you left." She stopped. The hallway was dim and smelled like old carpet, and someone's cooking from down the hall. And this was not the conversation she'd planned to have, because she hadn't planned any of this. She'd gotten in the car and driven, and now she was here, and the words she needed were still finding their shape. "The restart happened at 11:15. Your patches didn't survive it." Something moved across his face. Not surprise. He'd known this was coming. It was more like the expression of someone who had braced for an impact and felt it arrive. "How bad is it?" he asked. His voice was still the wrecked, stripped-down voice from this morning, except now it was worse. 40 million in limbo as of an hour ago, growing. The routing entries your notes describe are active, and we can't contain them because we don't... Our team doesn't... She stopped. "Our team doesn't know the system the way you do." The little girl had gotten bored with the conversation and had retreated back into the apartment. Victoria could hear her now, somewhere inside, talking to the rabbit in the specific, serious tone that small children use when playing. Ethan Cross looked at the middle distance for a moment. "What do you want?" he said. It was a simple question, and she didn't make it into more than it was. "I want you to come back." "You fired me." "I know. You fired me," he said again, not louder, not with heat, just with the emphasis of someone who needs the other person to understand that they understand without asking me a single question. I'd been awake for 2 days. I was holding the network together, and I fell asleep for maybe 20 minutes, and you walked in and didn't ask my name, didn't ask why I was there, didn't ask why every monitor in the room was lit up like a Christmas tree, and you fired me. He paused. "Do you know what I was doing when you walked in? I was trying to figure out if I could manually reroute the secondary junction so that the patch would be more stable. I had my hand on the keyboard when I fell asleep. I'm telling you that because I want you to understand what you walked into." Victoria held his gaze. "I understand now," she said. "I didn't then. I made a decision based on what I saw, and I didn't look further than the surface, and I was wrong. She did not add qualifications. She did not soften it toward herself. I was wrong, and I'm asking you to come back, not for me, not for the company exactly, for the businesses, for the people who depend on the payments going through. Your note said a lot of small businesses. He looked away. Daddy? The little girl appeared at the end of the short hallway. She was holding the rabbit up by one ear. Are you coming back? Yeah, Lilybug, he said. Give me a minute. She regarded him for a moment with enormous seriousness, then retreated. Ethan Cross leaned against the doorframe and rubbed his face with one hand. He was quiet for a long time, and Victoria let him be quiet, because she had done enough talking into silences today without knowing what was on the other side of them. I need 2 hours, he said finally. I need to sleep 2 hours and shower and arrange someone to watch Lily, and then I'll come. I can have someone. I'll arrange it, he said. And there was something in the way he said it that made clear this was not negotiable, that this was the one part of this situation he intended to control. Okay, Victoria said. He was already turning back inside. Then he stopped. The R7 junction, he said, without turning around. If your team is still in there, tell them to stop touching it. Just stop. Whatever they're doing, have them stop and wait for me. I'll call them right now. And somebody needs to pull the firewall logs from the last 12 days, the whole thing. Don't filter it, don't summarize it, just pull it. I'll need it when I get there. Okay. He finally looked back at her, just briefly, over his shoulder. His expression had shifted from the bleak flatness of before into something more concentrated, more purposeful, and she understood in that moment that this was what he actually looked like. Not the wreckage she'd seen this morning, but this. A man with a problem in front of him and the particular stillness of someone who knows how to think. 2 hours, he said. He closed the door. Victoria stood in the third-floor hallway for a moment. Somewhere inside apartment 3C, a little girl was talking to a stuffed rabbit. Below, the building's front door opened and closed. She took out her phone and called Sandra Park. Tell your engineers to stop touching R7, she said, and pull the firewall logs from the last 12 days. Everything. He's coming back. She walked back down the stairs to the car. Through the windshield, the city was its ordinary self. November gray, traffic, a bus going by with an advertisement for something she didn't register. Everything looked the way it always looked. She had the sensation, sitting in that car, of standing on the far side of something she couldn't walk back across. The morning felt like it had happened a long time ago. The plant on the 14th floor, the whiteboard diagrams, the way she'd stood in the operations center and seen exactly what she expected to see and nothing else. She started the car. She had a company to keep alive until Ethan Cross got there. Sandra Park was not a person who panicked. She had been working in financial technology infrastructure for 19 years, and in those 19 years she had seen systems fail in ways that were embarrassing, in ways that were expensive, and once, at a previous company, in ways that had ended careers and triggered federal inquiries. She had developed through all of that a particular relationship with crisis, a kind of controlled stillness that looked like calm from the outside, but was actually something more like the way a building looks calm while all the structural load shifts through its walls. Right now, standing in the doorway of the operations center with her phone in one hand and a printout of the firewall request she'd just sent in the other, she felt those walls doing a lot of work. Tell me what the numbers are, she said to Dale, who was sitting at the main monitoring station with 3 windows open on 2 screens and the expression of a man who was no longer quite sure what any of the numbers meant. Transaction failures are up to 63 confirmed, Dale said. That's payments that went out our side and haven't arrived at destination. Total value as of, he glanced at the clock, 2 minutes ago is approximately 67 million. And it's still moving. It's still moving. Every few minutes, another batch goes through the compromised junctions, and we can't stop it without shutting the whole network down. And if we shut the network down, we know what happens if we shut the network down. Sandra had been through that calculation 3 times in the last hour. A full shutdown would stop the bleeding, yes, but Titan Core's service agreement with its largest clients, the processing contracts that accounted for 60% of the company's revenue, included uptime guarantees with penalties that would make the stolen transactions look modest by comparison. They were boxed in. They couldn't stop the network. They couldn't fix the network. They were standing next to a wound and watching it bleed and holding very still. Her phone buzzed. Victoria Hale. Tell your engineers to stop touching R7. Pull firewall logs from last 12 days. Everything. He's coming back. Sandra read the message twice. Dale, she said. Yeah. Step away from R7. Dale looked at her. I was just trying to set... I know what you were trying to do. Step away from it and get me the full firewall logs from the last 12 days, unfiltered. He started to ask why, then seemed to decide that wasn't the most useful question right now. He moved his chair to a different station and started the log pull. Sandra looked at the network diagram still glowing on the main screen, at the red sections that had grown in the last 3 hours, from isolated patches to something that looked less like damage and more like a map of a deliberate plan. She thought about Ethan Cross, who had apparently been sitting in this room for 2 days looking at exactly this and not sleeping and eating granola bars and writing notes in the methodical, urgent handwriting she'd seen on those sticky notes. She had not read his security notification until this morning. It had come in Tuesday evening and sat in her queue behind 4 other items she'd been managing, and she had looked at the subject line and thought, I'll get to this tomorrow. She'd thought that about a lot of things over the years, and usually it was fine, because most critical notifications turned out to be less critical than their subject line suggested, and you learned to triage. She had learned today that Ethan Cross did not write critical in the subject line unless he meant it. She put her phone in her pocket and walked back to the center of the operations floor. Kevin, she said to the second engineer who was working at a station near the wall, I need you to start documenting every affected transaction. Build me a list, transaction ID, origin, destination, amount, timestamp. I want it sortable and I want it current. Update it every 10 minutes. That's going to be a long list, Kevin said. I know it's going to be a long list. That's why I want you to start now. She pulled a chair up to the monitoring station and sat down. If Ethan Cross was coming back, and apparently he was, which was the first thing that had happened today that felt like a foothold on solid ground, then she was going to make sure that when he arrived, the information he needed was already organized, already accessible, already one step closer to usable. She couldn't do what he could do in that network. She couldn't reverse engineer a sophisticated intrusion in a legacy payment system with 2 days of no sleep and a folder of sticky notes. But she could do this. She started building the documentation. The call came from Gerald Stanton at 2:15. Victoria was back in her office, moving between phone calls and her laptop, managing the thing that she'd already recognized as the second crisis running parallel to the technical one, the client crisis. 6 of Titan Core's enterprise clients had called in the last 90 minutes. 3 had gotten through to account managers who had tried to assure them that the situation was under control, which was technically not true, but was also not entirely false, depending on how generously you define control. 2 had escalated to Mark Hensley's team. 1, the CFO of a regional hospital network whose payroll processing ran through Titan Core, had called Victoria's direct line and spent 8 minutes asking questions she couldn't fully answer yet. She had handled it the way she handled things she couldn't fully answer. She said what was true, which was that there was a technical issue affecting a portion of payment routing, that her team was actively working to resolve it, and that she would provide a direct update within 4 hours. She did not say the word cyber attack, though that was what it was, because saying that word to a hospital CFO before she had more information would turn one 8-minute call into something much longer and much more complicated. When Stanton's name appeared on her phone, she answered it on the second ring. Gerald? Victoria. He had the measured tone of a man who had decided to be diplomatic about something he didn't feel diplomatic about. I've been briefed by Mark's team. Can you tell me what's actually happening? We have a compromised section of the payment routing layer that's diverting a percentage of transactions to unauthorized endpoints. We're working to contain it and recover the affected payments. A pause. How long has this been happening? This was the question she'd been dreading, not because she didn't know the answer, but because the answer was bad. Based on what our infrastructure team has found, the intrusion may have been in the system for approximately 11 days. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that she could hear, faintly, the sound of Stanton exhaling. 11 days, he said. That's preliminary. We're still reviewing the logs. Victoria, I need to ask you something directly, and I'm going to ask you to be direct back. He waited a beat. Is this connected to the engineer who was removed from the building this morning? She had expected this question. She had been expecting it since approximately 10:30, when she first understood what Ethan's notes meant. Ethan Cross identified the intrusion on Tuesday night, she said. He had been working to contain it without raising a full alert, for reasons that are in his documentation and that made operational sense given how the attack was structured. He has been asked to return to assist with the recovery. He's been asked to return? Stanton's voice had a quality she couldn't quite name. The man you fired this morning. Yes. Because he was the only one who understood what was happening. Yes. Another pause. And did anyone, before you made that decision this morning, did anyone check whether there might be a reason he was in that room at that hour in that condition? Victoria did not answer the question immediately because the honest answer was no, and she had spent the last several hours sitting with the weight of that no, and she didn't need Gerald Stanton to help her understand what it meant. I made a decision with the information I had, she said. It was the wrong decision. I'm focused right now on correcting it. The board is going to want a briefing. They'll have one. Give me until tomorrow morning. Victoria, Gerald, I have a technical crisis that is actively moving right now. I will brief the board tomorrow morning. I need to go. She hung up and sat for a moment in the particular silence of an office where everything is going wrong at once, and you are the person responsible for making it go right. Then she opened her laptop and went back to work. Problem? Ethan Cross arrived at Titan Core at 3:47 in the afternoon. He came through the lobby in jeans and a clean shirt and a jacket, and he had clearly showered, though the 2 hours of sleep he'd managed to get were written across his face in the particular way that 2 hours looks when it's trying to cover a 48-hour debt. He had a canvas bag over one shoulder. He showed his badge at the security desk by habit, then seemed to remember that his badge access had likely been revoked, and there was a brief, uncomfortable exchange while the security desk looked up the override authorization that Sandra had put in place an hour earlier. Sandra met him at the elevator. They rode up to 17 in silence for a moment. Kevin has a full transaction log running, Sandra said. Current count is 91 affected payments, total value around 89 million. I told Dale to stop touching R7 around 2 hours ago. Ethan nodded. He was looking at the elevator doors. Did he touch it before you told him? Some. I'm not sure what he did exactly. Ethan made a small sound that wasn't quite a sigh. Okay, I'll check it first. The firewall logs are pulled and on a drive on the main station. 12 days, full, unfiltered. Good. He glanced at her. Thank you for that. For setting it up before I got here. It seemed like the useful thing to do, Sandra said. The elevator opened. He stepped out into the operations center and stopped. The room was more populated than it had been this morning. 5 engineers were at various stations, and the energy in the room had the particular texture of people who are working hard, but are aware they're working without the knowledge they actually need. When Ethan walked in, several of them looked up, and there was a moment, a few seconds of recognition, that had a complicated quality to it. These were people who knew him, or knew of him. Some of them had probably been told what happened this morning. Some of them were probably watching him walk back through the door and trying to reconcile the fact of it with their understanding of how these things usually went. Ethan didn't address any of it. He walked to the main station, set his bag on the floor, looked at the network diagram for about 30 seconds, and said, Kevin, where are you? Kevin raised his hand from a station near the wall. The transaction log you're building, is it queryable or just a spreadsheet? It's queryable. I set it up in a local database. Good. I want to run some filters against it in a bit. Can you give me access? Already on the shared drive. Ethan sat down. He plugged in the drive with the firewall logs. He opened 4 windows across 2 monitors, the network diagram, the live transaction feed, the firewall log viewer, and a terminal window that he typed something into quickly, too quickly for Sandra, standing behind him to follow. Then he said, to no one in particular, somebody tell me what Dale did with R7. Dale, from the far side of the room, cleared his throat. I saw that one of the routing entries had a parameter I thought I could overwrite. I made 2 attempts. Both failed. I don't think I changed anything. Did you log the attempts? Yes. Send me the log. The log appeared in his email. He read it. Something in his shoulders relaxed slightly, which Sandra took as a good sign. "Okay," Ethan said. "You didn't make it worse. You also didn't make it better, but you didn't make it worse." He pulled up the firewall log. "Everybody who isn't actively monitoring a live feed, I need the room quiet for a bit. I need to find something and I need to concentrate." The room got quiet. Sandra found a chair near the door and sat down and watched him work. What he did over the next 40 minutes was not dramatic in any visible way. He was mostly still. He looked at the firewall logs with the focused patience of someone reading something they expect to understand eventually, and occasionally he typed something, and occasionally he made a note on the legal pad he'd taken from his bag. Once he said, quietly, "There you are," in the way someone says it when they've found what they were looking for and are not particularly happy about it. At 4:30, he said, "Sandra." She crossed the room to him. He pointed at a section of the firewall log. The insertion happened 9 days ago, not 11. The attackers were in the network for 11 days, but they placed the routing modifications 9 days ago. Here, he indicated a line in the log, through an authenticated session using credentials belonging to an account that was deactivated 8 months ago. Sandra leaned in. A ghost account. An account that should have been deleted when the employee left and wasn't. It happens. They found it, probably through reconnaissance, and used it to gain network-level access in a way that looked like internal traffic. He sat back. They're good. Whoever built this is genuinely good. The modifications they made to the routing layer are designed to look like legitimate load balancing entries. If you don't know exactly what you're looking for, you read right past them. How did you find it? He was quiet for a moment. 2 weeks ago, I was doing a routine audit of the routing table, and I found one entry that didn't have a corresponding originating ticket. Usually that means paperwork error. Somebody made a change and forgot to log it. I was going to flag it and move on, but something about it bothered me, so I looked deeper. That's when I started finding the others. He looked at the log. 9 entries total, each one redirecting a small percentage of specific transaction types to cascade endpoints. Small enough that individually each one is well within normal variance. Collectively, they're siphoning. The 48 hours you spent in here, I was tracing the cascade endpoints, trying to figure out where the money was actually going, and keeping the redirections isolated so they couldn't fully activate. He paused. I was close. I had 6 of the 9 endpoints mapped. I needed maybe another 12 hours, and I would have had enough to hand to law enforcement and to start the recovery protocol. The weight of the morning sat in the room between them. Sandra didn't name it. She didn't need to. "What do you need from us right now?" she asked. He picked up his legal pad. "First, I need to map the remaining 3 endpoints. That's going to take 2 or 3 hours. While I do that, I need someone who can write targeted firewall rules on my instruction. I'll call out addresses as I identify them, and I need them blocked in real time." "That's Kevin." "Okay, Kevin." He looked toward the far station. "Kevin, you're with me, and I need Dale on the transaction recovery side. Start working on a reconciliation protocol. We're going to need to manually reroute the affected payments once we've neutralized the redirections, and that means we need a complete picture of exactly where each one got stuck." "He's on it," Sandra said. "Third thing." He turned and looked at her directly. "I need somebody to get me food. I don't care what. Anything." Sandra almost smiled. "I'll order from the place downstairs." Victoria came to the operations floor at 5 o'clock. She didn't announce herself. She pushed open the door and stood near the wall and looked at the room, which had reorganized itself. Literally, physically, the chairs had moved, the stations had shifted, around the quiet center of gravity that was Ethan Cross at the main workstation. He was on the phone with someone, his voice low and technical, and Kevin was beside him typing fast, and Dale was at a separate station with what appeared to be a database interface open and a yellow highlighter in his hand. The energy was different. The room still had urgency. That hadn't changed. $89 million in missing payments was not a thing the room could forget. But the frantic, directionless quality of the afternoon was gone. In its place was something that felt like traction, like the turning of a wheel that had found its surface. Victoria stood near the wall and watched. After a few minutes, Ethan hung up the phone, typed something quickly, and said to Kevin, "Block 45.133.28 45.114 and the full 45.133.28.0/24 range. Priority 1. Kevin typed. Done. That's 7 of 9. He made a mark on his legal pad. 2 more. He hadn't looked up when she came in, but after another moment he said without turning, Ms. Hale. Mr. Cross? She crossed the room. How does it look? He glanced at her briefly. We've identified and blocked 7 of the 9 cascade endpoints. Once we have all 9, the siphoning stops. No new transactions will be affected. Then we deal with the backlog, the payments that are already in limbo. How long for the remaining 2? An hour, maybe 2. The last 2 are behind another routing layer. They put their best obfuscation there, which means they expected us to find the first 7 eventually. The last 2 were always going to be the hard part. He said this without drama, just with the factual tone of someone describing terrain. After that, maybe 6 hours to work through the recovery protocol on the affected transactions. Some will be straightforward, some will need manual intervention. A few might need us to coordinate with the receiving banks, and that's going to extend the timeline. Victoria did the arithmetic. So we're looking at, best case, everything resolved by early tomorrow morning. Best case, yes. She nodded. She looked at the network diagram on the main monitor, at the red sections that had not fully receded but had, she thought, stopped growing. The board wants a briefing tomorrow morning. Then you'll have something to tell them. She looked at him. He was already looking back at the screen. He hadn't said it with bitterness, exactly. It was more like a statement of fact from someone who had moved past the part of the day where bitterness had a purpose and was fully inside the part where there was only the work. I ordered food, Sandra said from behind her. Should be here in 20 minutes. Good, Ethan said. Kevin, while we're waiting, show me what you did with the packet capture filter. I want to see what you set up. Victoria stepped back from the station and stood near Sandra. He's going to fix it, Sandra said quietly, not as a question. Yeah, Victoria said. She watched Ethan lean forward toward the screen, pulling up a new window, explaining something to Kevin in a low voice. He is. The food arrived in brown paper bags, sandwiches, chips, 2 containers of soup that were already slightly less than hot. Sandra left them on the table near the door, and within 15 minutes half of them were gone, eaten standing up, eaten between keystrokes, eaten by people who had apparently not noticed until the bags arrived that they'd been in the building for 9 or 10 or 11 hours without stopping. Ethan ate a sandwich in 4 minutes and went back to the log. By 6:30, the room had taken on the particular quality of a long siege. Not desperate anymore, not panicked, but compressed. People talking less, faces turned toward screens. The overhead lights had that flat institutional quality that only becomes apparent when you've been under them too long. And outside the narrow windows, the city had gone dark in the way that Chicago goes dark in November, fast and complete, like a door closing. Victoria stayed. This surprised several people, she could tell. There was a version of CEO behavior that involved checking in, receiving updates, delegating responses, and then managing from a comfortable remove. She had done that version in previous roles, and she understood its logic. Presence at the scene of a crisis could mean being in the way, could mean adding a performance layer to a room that needed to be functional. But she stayed, and she stayed quietly, reading from her laptop, responding to emails, fielding calls in the hallway, and coming back. She wasn't in the way. She was just there. At 8:17, Ethan said, "Got it." Kevin looked up. 8? 8, and 9's right behind it. Look. He moved aside so Kevin could see the screen, pointed at something in the log. They daisy-chained the last 2. 8 feeds into 9. Block 8 and 9 drops off on its own. Kevin was already typing. 45.67.199.208 and the /28 subnet. Blocking. 20 seconds of silence. It's stopped, Dale said from across the room, looking at his station. I'm not seeing new entries in the redirect log. The last batch went through at 8:13. Nothing since. The room held still for a moment, not celebrating, just registering. Okay, Ethan said. He took a breath and looked at the ceiling briefly and looked back down. Now we deal with what's already out there. The recovery protocol was not elegant. It was the opposite of elegant. It was painstaking, iterative, and in several cases involved Ethan calling bank operations centers directly and navigating the particular bureaucratic resistance of institutions that don't like to move money without extensive documentation at 9 in the evening. He was patient with them in the way that someone is patient when they know the alternative is worse. Patient not as a personality trait, but as a calculated decision made new every few minutes. Dale worked the reconciliation database. Kevin handled the firewall and routing corrections on Ethan's instruction. Sandra coordinated with the account management team downstairs, who were still fielding calls from clients and needed updated information every 40 minutes. Victoria made the hard calls herself. The hospital network CFO had called twice more. She called him back at 9:30 and told him for the first time that the issue was a deliberate network intrusion, that the payments affecting his organization were identified and in active recovery, and that he would have a written status report by 6 the following morning. He was not happy. He asked questions she answered directly. By the end of the call, he was still not happy. But he was, she thought, no longer afraid, which was the most she could offer right now. At 11:40, Ethan said, 83 of 91 recovered. The remaining 8? Sandra asked. 4 need bank coordination on the other end. I've got reference numbers and I'll send them to your accounts team to follow up tomorrow morning. 3 have technical discrepancies in the routing path that I want to re-examine before I force push the recovery. And 1, he paused. 1 is going to be a problem. How big a problem? The transaction is for $4.3 million. It belongs to a commercial construction company in Indianapolis. It was the 3rd batch that went through the compromised junction, and it got fragmented. Part of it followed the cascade endpoint. Part of it got hung up in an error state in our own network. The fragmentation makes recovery complicated. Not impossible, but complicated. Timeline? Tomorrow. Maybe tomorrow afternoon. I need to approach it fresh. He looked at her. He looked for the first time in several hours, like someone who was running on fumes again. The brief rest and the food had carried him through, but it was nearly midnight, and the adrenaline of the work was metabolizing into something flatter and heavier. The urgent part is done. The network is clean. What's left is recoverable. It just takes time. Sandra looked at Victoria, who nodded. Go home, Sandra said to Ethan. He didn't argue. He sat for another moment, made a series of notes on his legal pad, and then tore out the pages and set them neatly beside the keyboard. He looked at the room, at Dale, who raised a hand, at Kevin, who said, "Thanks, man," with the specific gravity of someone who had spent the evening watching someone do something they couldn't do and knew it. Ethan picked up his bag. At the door he stopped and turned back, and for a second Victoria thought he was going to say something to her, some accounting of the day, some version of "I told you so" that would have been entirely earned. Instead, he looked at Sandra. "The ghost account," he said. "The deactivated credentials they used to get in. Pull every deactivated account in the user database going back 3 years and cross-check against current network access permissions. I bet there are more." "First thing tomorrow," Sandra said. He nodded. He left. The door closed behind him, and the room held the particular silence of after the crisis, after the long hours, after the work that had been done and the damage that had been contained and the parts that hadn't been contained yet but would be. Sandra put her hands on the desk and looked at the network diagram, which was clean now, the red sections reduced to amber markers that indicated where the recovery work still waited. Victoria stood in the center of the room. She was thinking about the morning, about the plant on the 14th floor, and the whiteboard diagrams, and walking into this room at 7 o'clock, certain of what she was seeing. She was thinking about the word culture, and what she'd meant by it, and what it actually was, and whether those two things were the same. Outside the narrow windows, Chicago was doing what it always did at midnight, going on, indifferent, enormous, alive in the specific way cities are alive when you are small inside them. The payments moved through the network, or most of them did, most of them now going where they were supposed to go, carrying money from one hand to another, keeping things running in the invisible way that things run when they are working right. She thought about a little girl in star pajamas asking her father if he was coming back. She turned off the light in the operations center and took the elevator down. Victoria didn't sleep much. She got home at 12:40, ate a bowl of cereal standing at the kitchen counter because cooking anything felt like a decision she didn't have the energy to make, and then sat at her dining table with her laptop open for another hour and a half, writing the board briefing. Not the sanitized version, not the version where the facts were arranged to make the decisions look better than they were. The real version. She had decided, somewhere between the operations center and her car, that she was going to tell the board exactly what had happened and exactly what her role in it was, and that she was going to do it before someone else's version of the story reached them first. She wrote until 2 in the morning. Then she went to bed and lay there looking at the ceiling for a while before sleep arrived. And when it did, it was the restless, shallow kind that doesn't feel like rest. Her alarm went off at 5:30. She was in the building by 6:45. The overnight team on the operations floor, a different rotation from the crew that had been there during the crisis, gave her a status update that she read in the elevator on her phone. 86 of 91 transactions now recovered. The 4 requiring bank coordination had been handed to the account management team with reference numbers and a protocol Ethan had written out before he left. 2 of the 3 technically complex ones had been resolved by Dale working until 1 in the morning. 1 remained, and the $4.3 million fragmented payment to the construction company in Indianapolis was still waiting for Ethan. The board meeting was at 9. What? Gerald Stanton arrived at 8:30, which was the earliest she'd seen him in the building in the 3 days she'd been there. He came directly to her office, knocked once, and opened the door without waiting for an answer, which told her something about the state of his patients. "I talked to 2 board members last night," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk without being asked. He had the slightly careful grooming of a man who had also not slept enough and was compensating. "Which 2?" Victoria asked. "Richard Holt and Marianne Cho. Richard is concerned. Marianne is asking questions about protocol and liability, which means she's talked to legal counsel." "That's her job." "Yes, it is." He looked at her. "Victoria, I want to say something to you that I want you to hear as professional counsel and not as—" He paused, seeming to choose his words, "not as whatever else it might sound like, given the circumstances." "Say it. The way you handled this morning will define the first chapter of your tenure here more than anything else, more than the crisis itself." He leaned forward slightly. "There are ways to frame what happened that distribute the responsibility more evenly. The security notification that wasn't escalated, the system restart that was authorized by operations, not by you, the infrastructure team that had been flagging under-resourcing for 2 years without anyone acting on it." He paused. "None of that is untrue." Victoria looked at him for a long moment. She understood what he was offering. She'd seen it done before, in other companies, other boardrooms. The careful redistribution of accountability, the strategic arrangement of facts so that the narrative flowed away from any single point of failure. It was not dishonest, exactly. It was the art of institutional self-protection, and Gerald Stanton had been practicing it for 14 years and was probably quite good at it. "I appreciate that," she said. "I'm going to tell them what happened." He sat back. "All of it. All of it." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Something between frustration and something else. Something more reluctant. "You know what they'll do with that." "I know what some of them will try to do with it," she said. "That's different from what they'll actually do." He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up. "I'll see you in the boardroom." There were 9 board members present at 9 o'clock, in person or on video. Victoria stood at the head of the walnut table with her laptop connected to the display and her briefing document on the screen, and she looked at them. Richard Holt, 64, who had been chair for 6 years and had the composed, careful face of a man who had sat through a great many of these. Marianne Cho, who was on video from what appeared to be an airport lounge and was already taking notes. The others arranged around the table in the particular posture of people who have received difficult news in advance and are now waiting to hear it confirmed. She didn't use the briefing document much. She had written it and she knew it, and reading from slides felt wrong for this conversation. "At approximately 6:50 on Wednesday morning," she began, "I entered the operations center on the 17th floor as part of my initial tour of the building. I found a senior infrastructure specialist asleep at his workstation. Without asking him his name, without asking why he was there, and without reviewing any of the monitoring data visible on the screens around him, I made the decision to terminate his employment on the spot. The room was very still. That employee was Ethan Cross. He had been in the operations center for 48 consecutive hours, managing an active network intrusion that he had identified Tuesday evening and reported through proper channels, in a notification that had not yet been reviewed by leadership. The manual safeguards he had implemented were the only thing preventing the intrusion from fully activating. His termination and the system restart that followed, authorized by operations using standard protocol, removed those safeguards. The intrusion activated at approximately 11:15 Wednesday morning. She walked them through the rest of it. The cascade endpoints, the fragmented transactions, the 91 affected payments totaling just under $90 million, the recovery effort that was now at 86 of 91. She was precise, and she was not defensive, and she did not use the word unfortunately, which was a word that had always struck her as a way of acknowledging damage while subtly declining to own it. When she finished, Richard Holt said, "What is the status of the remaining 5 transactions?" 4 are in bank coordination and will be resolved within 24 hours. 1, a $4.3 million payment to a commercial construction company, requires specialized recovery work that will be handled today by the infrastructure specialist. Ethan Cross, Marianne Cho said from the screen. She had stopped taking notes. Yes. Who you asked to return after terminating him? Yes. And he agreed. He did. Marianne Cho looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of someone processing something they find surprising. What is his current employment status? Technically, his termination was processed through HR yesterday morning. That needs to be addressed today. Victoria paused. I intend to reinstate him with back pay for the period of termination and to formally review his compensation and title in light of the contribution he's made and the level of expertise this incident has made clear he possesses. Another silence. Victoria. This was Richard Holt, his voice measured. I want to make sure I understand the full picture here. The intrusion itself, the 11 days the attackers were in the network before detection. That's a systemic failure that predates your tenure. The security notification that wasn't escalated, the gaps in monitoring configuration, the deactivated account that wasn't properly cleaned up, those are institutional failures that accumulated over years. They are, Victoria said. The decision you made Wednesday morning is mine, she said, completely. He looked at her. He had the eyes of someone who had been in enough rooms to know when someone was being strategic and when they were being honest, and she held his gaze and let him read whatever he needed to read. The board will want to discuss this in closed session, he said. I understand. You'll give us the room for an hour. Of course. She closed her laptop and walked out of the boardroom, and the door shut behind her with the soft, weighty click of a door that costs money, and she stood in the executive hallway for a moment. Drew was at his desk at the far end, watching her with the careful non-expression of someone trying not to appear to be watching. She walked past him toward the window at the end of the hall. Chicago was gray and flat outside, a November sky that couldn't decide whether it was going to rain. The city went on doing what it did, 40-something floors below her, indifferent to the boardroom behind her and the 48 hours that had led to it. She thought about something Ethan had said at his door, the specificity of it. I had my hand on the keyboard when I fell asleep. She had not understood, in the moment he said it, why he said that particular thing in that particular way. She understood it now. He had been telling her what kind of person he was, and she had not been listening, and she hadn't started listening until the price of not listening had become impossible to ignore. That bothered her more than the board meeting did. Ethan arrived at 8:50, while Victoria was still in with the board. Sandra met him in the lobby, and they rode up to 17 together. He looked better than he had at midnight, rested in the specific way that 8 hours of sleep looks after 48 hours without it, which is to say he looked functional rather than recovered, the deficit too large to close in one night. He had on a different shirt, dark green, and he dealt with the stubble, and he moved with the deliberate steadiness of someone who had decided that today was going to be a day he got through on competence alone. The construction company payment, he said in the elevator. Still waiting, Sandra said. Dale left notes. I read them. He got further than I expected. She glanced at him. He worked until 1. I know. I saw the timestamps. He was quiet for a moment. He's good. He just doesn't know the legacy layer well enough. Nobody does except me, which is, that's a problem we're going to need to address eventually. The elevator opened. He went directly to the main station, read Dale's notes, asked Kevin 2 questions, and began working. Sandra watched him for a moment. Then she said, "How are you doing, actually?" He didn't look up from the screen. "I'm fine." "Ethan." He paused. He looked at her, and there was something in his face that was more honest than fine. A tiredness that went past the physical, the kind that comes from a long time of doing work that matters without anyone noticing it matters. "I'm okay," he said. It's a lot. Yesterday was a lot." "Yes," Sandra said. "It was." He looked back at the screen. "How'd Lily do? Last night, with your neighbor watching her?" "She was fine. She made Mrs. Petrakis watched the same cartoon 3 times, apparently. He smiled at that, small and real. "Yeah, that sounds right. Ethan, for what it's worth, I read your security notification this morning. The full thing, properly this time." She paused. "It was thorough. It was exactly what a notification like that should be. The fact that it sat in my queue, Sandra, you had 4 other things in your queue. None of them were as important as that one." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "They weren't." He said it without cruelty, just with the flat accuracy of a fact that had already done its damage and didn't need to be argued anymore. She nodded. "Okay," she said. "I'm going to let you work." The board's closed session lasted an hour and 12 minutes. Victoria was called back in at 10:20. She sat down at the table and Richard Holt looked at her with the composed expression of a man who had finished deliberating and was now in the business of communicating the result. "The board's position," he said, "is that your decision Wednesday morning was a significant error of judgment, and that the error was compounded by the speed with which you acted without seeking context. We want that acknowledged formally." "It's acknowledged," Victoria said. "We also recognize that the underlying vulnerabilities that made this attack possible were systemic and long-standing, and that you inherited an infrastructure that had been under-resourced and under-monitored for years. The responsibility for that does not rest with you." He paused. "What we're asking is that you develop, within the next 30 days, a comprehensive review of Titan Core's security infrastructure and personnel management practices. Specifically, we want to understand how someone of Ethan Cross's apparent capability and knowledge can spend 48 hours preventing a catastrophe and have no one notice, not because of the attack, but as a matter of ordinary institutional awareness." Victoria looked at him. "That's a fair question. It's a question this company should have been asking for a long time." He folded his hands on the table. "We're not asking for your resignation, Victoria. We're asking for your correction. There's a difference." "I understand the difference," she said. "Good." He leaned back. "What do you need from us to support the recovery effort?" She told him. The board meeting ended at 11:15, and she walked out of the boardroom with a legal pad full of notes and a 30-day deadline, and the particular feeling of having walked through something and come out the other side still standing. She went up to 17. The operations center was quieter than it had been during the crisis. 3 people instead of 8. The emergency energy replaced by the focused, detailed work of cleanup. Ethan was still at the main station, and he was on the phone when she walked in, speaking in the precise, unhurried tone he used when explaining something technical to someone who wasn't. "The fragmentation happened at the routing junction level," he was saying, "which means we have the transaction record on our side, but the funds never fully resolved into a single outgoing packet. What I need from you is confirmation of whether a partial credit hit the receiving account, even a few cents, because that would tell me which path the first fragment took." He listened. "Okay, yes. Can you hold that for me? I'll be back to you in 20 minutes. He hung up and typed something quickly. Victoria said, "How is it going?" "Slowly," he said. "The fragmentation it's like the payment got cut in half and each half took a different route. One half resolved. One half is stuck in an error state on our end. I need to find the stuck half and force push it through a clean path, but I have to make sure I'm pushing it to the right destination and not doubling the successful half." He glanced at her. "It's delicate, but fixable." Yes. It's fixable. He paused. It's going to take another few hours. She pulled a chair up to the station beside him. Not at his station, but near it, and sat down. He looked at her briefly, something questioning in his face. I'm not going to hover, she said. I want to be here. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded and turned back to the screen. She sat there while he worked. She had her phone and her legal pad, and she returned emails and made notes and did the things that needed doing, but she kept the corner of her attention on him, on the steadiness of how he moved through the problem, the way he'd pause and think before doing anything, the way he talked to Kevin and to the bank operations person when he called them back. There was no performance in how he worked. He wasn't doing it for an audience. He was doing it because the problem was there, and the solution existed somewhere, and he was going to find it. At 12:40, he said, "Got it." Kevin looked up. The stuck fragment is in an error queue in the secondary routing buffer. I can see it. It's got the full 4.3 tagged to it, which means the first fragment that resolved was a routing confirmation, not actual funds. So we haven't doubled anything. He was already typing. I'm going to build a clean path from the buffer to the destination account directly, bypassing the junction layer entirely. Is that? Kevin started. It's not standard, but the junction layer is where it got broken, so I'm not going to send it through there again. He kept typing. This will take about 10 minutes to set up and then maybe another 5 to execute. The room waited. Victoria put down her phone. At 12:57, Ethan stopped typing. He looked at the screen. Then he picked up his phone and called the bank operations number he'd been using. This is Ethan Cross at Titancore, he said. I'm expecting a credit to hit account ending in 7741 in the next 60 seconds. Can you confirm when you see it? He waited. His face was neutral, the careful neutral of someone managing their own expectations. Then something shifted. Not dramatic, not a smile, just a very small release of something that had been held. Yes, that's it. 4.3 million, full amount, perfect. He paused. Thank you. I appreciate your patience with this. He hung up. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Just one moment. Then he made a mark on his legal pad, crossed something off a list, and looked at Kevin. That's 91 of 91, he said. Kevin made a sound that was somewhere between relief and a laugh. All of it? All of it. Sandra had ordered lunch, real lunch, not emergency granola bars, and it arrived at 1:15 and sat on the table near the door, and people ate it at their stations or standing up, the way people eat when they've been in a room together long enough that the normal self-consciousness of eating in front of colleagues has worn away. Victoria ate a sandwich at the station beside Ethan's. He was doing what she'd heard him call a verification pass, running through the full transaction log one more time to confirm that every recovered payment had resolved correctly, the kind of meticulous double-checking that most people skip when they're tired and the crisis has ostensibly passed. She watched him work for a while. Then she said, "Can I ask you something?" He looked at her. "When you found the intrusion Tuesday night, when you realized what it was, why didn't you trigger the full emergency protocol? Why manage it alone?" He put down his sandwich. He thought about the question for a moment, not like someone who didn't know the answer, but like someone deciding how much of the answer to give. The full emergency protocol includes a mandatory system restart, he said. It's written into the incident response plan. Any confirmed network intrusion triggers an automatic restart of core services. The logic is sound for most attack types, but this one, he paused, this one was specifically designed to survive our response protocol. They knew our playbook. If I triggered the full alert, the restart would have happened automatically within hours, and the attack would have activated before I had enough information to even understand what I was dealing with. So you made a call? I made a call. Keep it quiet, keep it contained, map the attack thoroughly enough to actually fix it rather than just poking it and making it worse. He picked up his sandwich again. I've been in this system for 8 years. I know where the bodies are buried. I know the parts that are fragile and the parts that are flexible and the parts that will break if you look at them wrong. That's not something you can read in a manual. It's time. It's 8 years of paying attention. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Nobody knew that about you. How much you knew. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite wry and not quite sad. People don't usually pay attention to the people who keep the lights on, he said. As long as the lights are on. She held his gaze. That's something I intend to change. He didn't respond to that directly. He finished his sandwich and turned back to the verification pass. She let it sit there between them because some things don't need to be argued into or argued out of. They just need to be said. The afternoon wore into early evening. The verification pass was complete by 3. The network was clean. The transaction log was reconciled. Sandra's team had begun the process of notifying affected clients with individual status reports on their recovered payments. Not a mass communication, but personal calls, account manager to client, with specifics and apologies and whatever goodwill could be salvaged from the experience of $90 million going briefly sideways. Most clients, it turned out, were relieved more than angry. The money had come back. That was the thing they'd been afraid wouldn't happen, and it had happened, and several of them expressed something close to gratitude, which surprised Mark Hensley, who had spent the day bracing for a different reception. Not all of them were relieved. The hospital network's CFO called back at 2:30, and that conversation was longer and harder, and it ended with a commitment to an in-person meeting next week and an acknowledgement, on Victoria's part, that Titan Core had to do better by clients who depended on the network for time-sensitive payments. He wasn't satisfied. She didn't try to make him satisfied. She tried to make him believe that she meant what she said, which was the only honest currency available to her at this point. At 4 o'clock, Sandra called a small debrief in the operations center. 6 people: Victoria, Sandra, Ethan, Dale, Kevin, and Mark Hensley, who had come up from 14 with his notebook and his careful nods. "Where are we?" Sandra said. Kevin gave the network status. Ethan gave the security status. Dale gave the transaction reconciliation status. Each of them was precise and brief. Hensley took notes. At the end, Sandra looked around the room. "What do we need to make sure this doesn't happen again?" A pause. Then Ethan said, "Do you want the real answer or the easy one?" "The real one," Victoria said. He set his legal pad on the desk and looked at it for a moment. "The real answer is that this company has been running critical payment infrastructure on aging architecture that was built for a different scale and a different threat environment. The monitoring systems are configured for the attacks that existed 5 years ago, not the ones that exist now. The incident response protocol has a critical flaw, the mandatory restart, that sophisticated attackers can exploit, and exploiting it is not complicated if you do your homework. And there is exactly one person in this building who understands the legacy routing layer well enough to do what I did this week." He paused. "One person is not a system. One person is a single point of failure." Silence around the table. "How long would it take to fix that?" Mark said. "Roughly." "The monitoring configuration, 2 weeks, maybe 3. If Sandra and I work on it together and we get buy-in to actually implement the changes without having to route everything through 4 levels of approval." He looked at Sandra, who nodded. "The architecture? That's a longer conversation. That's probably an 18-month project to do properly. But there are interim measures that would reduce the exposure significantly." He paused again. "The documentation problem. The fact that the knowledge of how this system works exists mostly in my head and nowhere else. That's a cultural issue. It's something I can work on, and will, but it requires time that I've historically been told is better spent on other things." Victoria looked at him. "Who told you that?" He met her eyes. "Previous management. The standing direction was to keep the systems running, not to document them. Documentation was considered," he seemed to choose the word carefully, "overhead." The word landed in the room with the particular weight of something that has been true for a long time and is only now being named out loud. "It's not overhead," Victoria said. "It's infrastructure, the same as the servers." He looked at her. He didn't say anything, but something in his face shifted, something careful and long-held. "I want a proposal from you," Victoria said. "From you and Sandra, together. A 30-day plan for the critical fixes and a roadmap for the longer-term architectural work. I'll take it to the board." She paused. "And I want the documentation project scoped as part of it, not as a side note, as a primary deliverable." He nodded slowly. "Ethan." She stopped. She had been saying his name in the direct, professional way she said everyone's name, but this felt like a different kind of moment. and she needed to be in it properly. I owe you an apology, a real one, not a transactional one. She kept her eyes on his. I walked into this building yesterday morning with a set of assumptions about what I was going to find, and I found something that fit the surface shape of those assumptions, and I acted. I didn't ask a single question. That was wrong, and the consequences of it were serious, and they were on me. She paused. I'm sorry. The room was very quiet. Mark Hensley had stopped writing. Ethan Cross looked at her for a long moment. He had the face of someone who had expected, on some level, for this moment to feel different than it did. Bigger, maybe, or more resolving. Instead, it just sat there, honest and insufficient and real. I know, he said. Not I accept your apology. Not it's okay. Just, I know. Which was more honest than either of those would have been. She nodded. The HR situation, Sandra said, carefully, into the silence. Being corrected today, Victoria said. Full reinstatement, back pay from yesterday morning, and a formal compensation review. Ethan looked at Sandra, then back at the table. Something in his posture shifted. Not relief exactly, more like the release of a tension that had been running at a frequency too low to consciously register. Okay, he said. Outside the narrow windows, the November dark was coming down again over Chicago. The same gray nothing of an evening that had no interest in whether the crisis was over, or whether anyone had learned anything, or whether the company that occupied floors 14 through 17 of a glass tower downtown was going to be okay. The city didn't know and didn't care. It just went on. But inside the operations center, 6 people sat around a table in the aftermath of something hard, and the network was running clean for the first time in 11 days, and the money had come home, and some things had been said that needed saying, and some of the damage was repaired and some of it wasn't. Not yet. Maybe not for a while. Dale, who had said very little during the debrief, looked up from his notebook. The ghost accounts, he said. Did anyone pull the full list? Sandra straightened. I asked IT to run it this morning. It came back with... She checked her phone. 14 deactivated accounts with residual network access permissions. 14. Nobody at the table looked surprised exactly. It was more the expression of people hearing the thing they'd expected to hear. 14, Ethan said. He looked at the table for a moment. Pull them all tonight, he said. Everyone. Already submitted the work order, Sandra said. He nodded. He picked up his pen. He wrote something on his legal pad. A note to himself, probably. Some technical reminder in the private shorthand of a man who had learned to externalize everything because he couldn't trust anyone else to remember it for him. Victoria watched him write it and thought, that is what 8 years of not being listened to looks like. She thought, I am going to fix that. She didn't say it. Not again, not tonight. She'd said enough. And actions were the currency that actually spent. And she had 30 days and a proposal to commission and a board that was watching and a company that had come very close to something it hadn't fully registered yet. She picked up her legal pad. She wrote, the 30-day proposal landed on Victoria's desk on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the crisis. It was 41 pages long. Sandra had formatted it cleanly. Section headers, appendices, a one-page executive summary at the front that could be handed to board members who wouldn't read the rest. But the substance of it, the actual thinking, was Ethan's, and you could tell that from the first paragraph of the summary, which did not begin with reassurances or qualifications, but with a direct statement of what the problem was and why it had persisted. Titan Core's payment infrastructure was designed in 2004 for a transaction volume and threat environment that no longer exists. It has been maintained, patched, and extended for 20 years by a small number of engineers who developed deep institutional knowledge that was never systematically documented or transferred. This is not a technology problem. It is a knowledge management problem that expresses itself as a technology vulnerability. The following proposal addresses both. Victoria read the full 41 pages the morning it arrived, with her door closed and her coffee going cold beside her laptop. She made notes in the margins. Not corrections, mostly questions. A few places where she wanted to understand the reasoning more clearly before presenting it to the board. When she finished, she sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment and thought that if someone had handed her this document on her first day and asked her to identify the person who wrote it, she would have said, senior director level, minimum, technical leadership. Someone the company should be working very hard to keep. She called Sandra. "It's good," she said when Sandra picked up. "It's very good," Sandra said. "The architecture roadmap especially." He laid out 3 phases with realistic timelines and actual resource requirements, not the kind of resource requirements that assume everything goes right. The monitoring reconfiguration, he said 2 to 3 weeks when we talked. Is that still the estimate? We're already 12 days in. We started the week after the incident. He and I have been working through it together, early mornings mostly, before the regular shift. A pause. He comes in at 6. Victoria thought about that. Does he know I know that? I don't think he's thought about it, Sandra said. That's what he does. He finds the time. After she hung up, Victoria sat for a while longer. Outside her window, the city was doing its November becoming December thing. The sky, a flat pewter that promised cold without committing to snow. She thought about the 41 pages, and about 6 in the morning, and about the 14 ghost accounts that Sandra's team had cleaned up in the first week, and the monitoring reconfiguration that was already halfway done, and all of it moving quietly forward, the way things move when the right people are finally being allowed to do the right work. Then she picked up her phone and called HR. The compensation review had been completed the previous week. Victoria had sat in on part of it, which was unusual. CEOs didn't typically sit in on individual compensation reviews, but she had insisted, and the HR director, a careful woman named Blythe Moreno, who had been at Titan Core for 9 years, had not argued with her. What the review found was not surprising, and was also, in its own quiet way, damning. Ethan Cross was being paid at the 58th percentile for senior infrastructure engineers in the Chicago market. His title, Senior Infrastructure Specialist, had not changed in 4 years, despite 2 performance reviews that rated him exceptional, and a series of informal expansions of his responsibilities that had never been formalized. He had not received a merit increase in 18 months, because the infrastructure department's budget had been frozen as part of a cost reduction initiative that was itself part of the previous CEO's attempt to improve margins ahead of a board review. The freeze had been lifted 8 months ago, and nobody had gone back to correct the gap it had created. Blythe had laid all of this out in the review with the neutral, professional precision of someone who was not going to editorialize, but was also not going to soften the picture. "What's the correction look like?" Victoria had asked. Blythe told her. The number was significant. Victoria had approved it the same afternoon. She had asked Blythe to handle the conversation with Ethan directly, professionally, with the specifics of the adjustment and the title change. They were moving him to Principal Infrastructure Engineer, which was a more accurate description of what he actually did. And without ceremony. She had specifically said without ceremony. She didn't want it to feel like a performance of institutional guilt. She wanted it to feel like a correction of an error, because that was what it was. Blythe had looked at her when she said that. "Most people want to be in the room for something like this," she'd said. "Not critically, just observationally." "I know," Victoria had said, "but it's not my moment. It's his." Ethan heard about the title change and the compensation adjustment on a Thursday afternoon from Blythe Moreno in a small conference room on the 15th floor that smelled faintly of the whiteboard markers on the wall. Blythe walked him through the numbers with the same neutral precision she used for everything, and he sat across from her and listened with his hands flat on the table, the way he sat when he was processing something and didn't want to react before he'd finished processing it. When she finished, he said, "The title change is retroactive to what date?" "We're backdating it 90 days, Blythe said, "to the date of your last performance review, which should have triggered a title review at the time." He nodded slowly. "The compensation adjustment takes effect with this pay period," she said, "and the back pay from the period of your termination, 2 days, will be in a separate line item in the same check." He was quiet for a moment. "The 2 days," he said. I wasn't expecting that." "It was part of the reinstatement terms," Blythe said. He looked at the table. There was something in his face that was not quite what Blythe expected. Not relief or satisfaction or even gratitude. It was more like the complicated expression of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and is now being told they can put it down, and finding that the act of putting it down surfaces everything the carrying cost. "Okay," he said, after a moment. "Thank you. Is there anything you want to ask about the process going forward?" Blythe said. He thought about it. Is there a formal mechanism for when someone on my team does work that's outside their job description? Is there a formal way to flag that for review? Not just for compensation, for title, for recognition, for making sure it gets documented. Blythe looked at him. There's supposed to be. In practice, it depends on the manager. Right, he said. That's what I thought. He stood up. I'd like to talk to someone about formalizing it, making it a process that doesn't depend on whether the manager remembers to do it. That's a conversation for HR leadership, Blythe said. I can set something up. I'd appreciate that. He walked out of the conference room and took the elevator up to 17, and he sat at his station and stared at the network diagram for a while without actually seeing it, thinking about what it meant to have a number changed on a piece of paper, what it reflected and what it didn't. The number was more accurate now. The title was more accurate. Neither of them captured the 48 hours, the energy drinks on the floor, the sticky notes in 3 colors, the moment he'd fallen asleep with his hand on the keyboard. But accuracy was something. He'd been working in a place that couldn't even manage accuracy for 8 years. He picked up his pen and went back to the documentation project. Okay. The documentation project was what he called it when he was talking to Sandra or Kevin or Dale. But in his own head, he thought of it differently. He was building, essentially, a complete technical record of everything he knew, everything that existed in his head that did not exist anywhere else, the accumulated understanding of a system that had grown in idiosyncratic, undocumented ways across 2 decades, and that only cohered at present in the mind of one person. He had started it the Monday after the crisis, which was the day Sandra told him Victoria had asked for it to be scoped as a primary deliverable rather than overhead. He had read that twice, and then sat for a moment with the particular feeling of something long denied being suddenly, simply allowed. He worked on it every morning from 6 to 8 before the regular shift, in the quiet of the operations center when the overnight crew was wrapping up and the day shift hadn't fully arrived yet. He had a system. He worked through the routing layer by section, documenting not just what each component did, but why it was built the way it was, what decisions had been made and by whom, and what constraints they'd been working under, because you couldn't understand a 20-year-old system without understanding the decisions that had shaped it. He wrote in plain language. He had a specific policy about this, which he articulated once to Dale when Dale asked why the documentation read more like a technical narrative than a reference manual. Because a reference manual is only useful if you already know what you're looking for, Ethan said. This has to be readable by someone who's never touched this system and needs to understand it under pressure. Reference manuals don't help you at midnight when something's broken. And Dale had thought about this and then said, "That's going to be a lot of writing." "Yeah," Ethan said. "It is." By the end of the 3rd week, he had completed the routing layer documentation and was 2/3 through the security architecture section. Kevin had started reviewing the routing layer docs and had already found 2 places where the documented behavior didn't match what he observed in the live system, which Ethan took as a sign that the project was working. You couldn't find discrepancies in documentation that didn't exist. The proposal presentation to the board happened on the last Thursday of November. Victoria presented it. She had asked Ethan if he wanted to be there, making clear that it was a genuine question and not a directive, and he had said he'd rather not, that boardrooms were not where he did his best thinking, and she had said she understood and had not pushed. She walked the board through all 41 pages in 90 minutes. She knew the material well enough by then to present it without notes, which helped. It read as command and confidence rather than recitation, and the board responded to that. The questions were substantive. Richard Holt asked about the phasing of the architectural overhaul and whether the interim measures were genuinely protective or primarily cosmetic. She gave him Ethan's answer because Ethan's answer was better than anything she would have generated on her own. The interim measures reduced the attack surface by approximately 60% and eliminated the specific vulnerability class that had been exploited. They were not comprehensive protection, but they were not cosmetic, and the difference between them and the full architectural solution was the difference between a locked door and a locked door with a security system. Holt had nodded at that. "Who wrote that?" he'd asked. "Ethan Cross," she said. Another board member, a woman named Patricia Webb, who sat on the technology committee and rarely spoke in full board sessions, said, "I'd like to meet him." Victoria looked at her. "I'll arrange it." The budget request for Phase 1 of the architectural overhaul was approved with one modification. They wanted quarterly progress reports rather than semi-annual, which was fair, and the monitoring reconfiguration was approved for immediate completion. The documentation project was approved as a formal initiative with dedicated time allocated to it, which meant it was no longer something Ethan was doing at 6 in the morning out of personal commitment. It was now, officially, part of his job. She called Sandra on her way back to her office. Full approval, she said. Phase 1 budget cleared. Documentation is formalized. Patricia Webb wants to meet Ethan. Sandra was quiet for a moment. How did it go? Really? It went like a boardroom where something bad happened and people are trying to make sure it doesn't happen again, Victoria said, which is exactly how it should go. She told Ethan herself that afternoon. She went up to 17 rather than calling or emailing because she'd noticed that the things that mattered got lost in email, lost in the efficiency of transmission, stripped of whatever weight they needed to carry. She found him at his station, mid-documentation, a section of routing architecture open on one monitor and a draft document on the other. The board approved everything, she said. He looked up. Phase 1 budget, monitoring completion, documentation is a formal initiative. She paused. Patricia Webb on the technology committee wants to meet you. He processed this. To what end? She's interested in your perspective on infrastructure governance, how companies like Titan Core should think about it structurally. Victoria pulled a chair to the side of his station. She's not going to interrogate you. She's genuinely interested. He looked at the screen. I'm not good in boardrooms. You don't have to be. You just have to be you. She paused. That turned out to be enough. He glanced at her. There was something in his expression that was still guarded, not hostile, just careful, the way someone is careful when they've been caught unguarded before and haven't fully decided whether the new circumstances warrant a different posture. How's Lily? Victoria asked. The guard shifted almost imperceptibly. She's good. She's on a phase where everything has to be a specific color. Her cup has to be the blue one, her plate has to be the yellow one. If you give her the wrong one, it's... He made a small gesture that communicated significant domestic consequence. How old is she now? 5 in January. Does she know what you do? What happened? He thought about it. I told her I had to fix something at work that was broken. She asked if I used a screwdriver. A brief, unguarded moment of something real in his face. I told her not exactly. Victoria smiled. What did she say? She said I should have tried a screwdriver. Then she went back to her cartoon. The smile stayed on Victoria's face for a moment, and it was the first time in the 3 weeks since the crisis that her face had done that without the smile being a professional tool, without it being deployed to reassure someone or soften something. It was just a smile. She sounds like a good kid, she said. She is, Ethan said, simply without elaboration. The way someone says a thing that is so completely true that ornament would diminish it. The weeks after the board meeting had a different texture than the weeks before. It was not that everything was suddenly right. The architectural overhaul was a long, complex project with bureaucratic friction and budget negotiation and the particular challenges that came with modernizing a live system that processed $600 million a day and could not simply be taken offline while the work happened. There were setbacks. In the second week of December, a portion of the new monitoring configuration generated false positives that briefly lit up the operations center in a way that, for about 20 minutes, felt exactly like the beginning of the crisis, until Ethan identified the trigger and corrected the filter parameters. He was calm about it, in the way that someone is calm when they've been through the real thing and this is not it, and his calm moved through the room like a correction. There was also the ongoing client work. Mark Hensley's team spent the better part of 3 weeks on remediation calls, visiting major clients in person, presenting the security review, explaining what had been done and what was being done, and how the incident had been handled. Most clients were satisfied eventually with the response. The hospital network signed a contract extension in December, which surprised several people and which the CFO, in the call where it was formalized, attributed directly to the speed and completeness of the payment recovery. Every dollar came back, he said on the call. That mattered. Victoria, who was on the call, said, "That was our infrastructure team." She She said it without preamble, and she didn't elaborate, and she moved the conversation forward, but she had said it, and Mark Hensley, who was also on the call, wrote something in his notebook. Gerald Stanton asked to meet with her in mid-December. He came to her office rather than requesting a boardroom, which she took as a signal that this was not a formal conversation. He sat in the chair across from her desk, the same chair he'd sat in on the morning of the board meeting, and looked at her with the measured expression he used when he was being neither adversarial nor deferential. "I want to tell you something," he said. She waited. "When you walked into that board meeting and told them exactly what happened, exactly, without any architecture around it, I thought you were making a mistake." He paused. "I've been thinking about it since, about why it worked, about what I expected to happen and what actually happened." "What did you expect to happen?" "I expected Holt and the others to see vulnerability, a new CEO who made a significant error in her first 24 hours and was admitting it openly. I expected them to see someone who could be managed." He looked at her steadily. "What they saw instead was someone who understood what had happened well enough to own it without qualification, and there's a version of strength in that I hadn't fully credited." Victoria looked at him for a moment. "Is this an apology, Gerald? I genuinely can't tell." Something moved across his face that was almost humor. "It's an acknowledgement," he said, "of the difference between the kind of leadership I understand and the kind you're practicing. I'm not sure they're incompatible. I'm still working that out." "That's fair," she said. He stood up. At the door he stopped. "The engineer," he said. "Cross." "What about him?" "He declined to come to the board presentation." "He did? And you let him?" "He told me boardrooms aren't where he does his best thinking," she said. "He was right. The work he does happens in the operations center at 6 in the morning. Putting him in a boardroom to explain it would have been for our benefit, not his or the company's." Stanton considered this. 14 years I've been here," he said. "I never knew his name." Victoria didn't say anything. "That's not a defense," he said. It's just a fact I'm sitting with." He left. Victoria sat at her desk for a while after he was gone, looking at the city through her window. The December sky was doing the thing it did in Chicago in December, which was pressed down on everything low and gray and cold, and the lights in the buildings across the street were already on at 4 in the afternoon. She thought about names, about how many names she hadn't known when she arrived, about the ones she knew now. Dale, who stayed until 1 in the morning reconciling transactions and hadn't needed to be asked. Kevin, who had sat beside Ethan for 6 hours learning how to block network addresses on the fly. Sandra, who had pulled the firewall logs and ordered food and documented every affected transaction while the crisis was still happening, quietly, without being asked. She had arrived at this company 3 weeks ago with a legal pad full of notes about culture and accountability and what she intended to change. The plant in the corner, the whiteboard diagrams, the employee asleep at his workstation. She had been right about some of it. She had been badly wrong about the most important thing. Culture, she was understanding now, was not the thing you announced or the standards you posted on a wall. It was the thing that happened in the specific moments when the choice was hard. It was whether you asked a single question before you pointed at the door. It was whether the security notification sat in the queue. It was whether the knowledge inside one person's head was worth anyone's time to extract and preserve before it was too late. She picked up her pen. She had a memo to write, a proposed amendment to Titan Corps' incident response protocol, the mandatory restart clause specifically, which she and Ethan and Sandra had discussed at length and which needed to be replaced with something more nuanced, something that allowed for human judgment in cases where the standard protocol would make things worse. It was not a simple change to make. It required sign-off from legal, from the board's technology committee, from the third-party auditors who had helped write the original protocol. She had started the process 2 weeks ago. She wrote, "On the last Friday before Christmas, the operations center had a small gathering. It was not a party, exactly. Nobody had planned it as a party. Sandra had ordered a tray of food from a place near the building, and someone had brought a box of cookies, and the day shift and part of the evening shift were in the room at the same time because of the overlap in the new scheduling protocol that Ethan had proposed. Cross-shift overlap, 1 hour, so that knowledge passed between rotations by conversation rather than handoff notes. Victoria came up at 5:30. She had not been told about the gathering, which meant nobody had felt they needed to stage it for her, which she took as a sign of something real. She stood near the door with a cup of coffee she'd brought from her office and watched the room. Dale was explaining something to one of the overnight engineers, something on the documentation judging by what was on the screen. Kevin was on a call but was eating a cookie with his free hand. The two monitors at Ethan's station were dark, which meant he had left for the day. Sandra appeared at her elbow. "He left at 4, she said. Lily's school had something. A performance? A holiday concert, I think. He mentioned it Monday." Victoria nodded. She looked at the room, at the people in it, at the screens showing the network running clean, at the documentation folder pinned to the shared drive that now had 32 completed sections and was growing. "How is the monitoring reconfiguration?" she said. "Done," Sandra said. "As of this morning. Fully implemented and verified." Victoria looked at her. "You finished early." "We finished early," Sandra smiled slightly. Ethan had a theory about the configuration sequence that cut about 3 days off the timeline. He was right. "He usually is," Victoria said. "Yes," Sandra said. "He usually is." They stood there for a moment, the two of them, in the doorway of the operations center where this had all started and where it was in some ways still going on. The long, undramatic work of fixing things properly rather than fast, of building something that would hold. Outside the narrow windows, Chicago was doing its December thing, cold and dark and lit up in the particular way it gets lit up in December, millions of small lights against the dark, enough of them that the city glowed. Inside, the network hummed. The money moved, everything going exactly where it was supposed to go. January came in the way Chicago Januaries always do, without apology, without the grace period that people in other cities expect from the new year. The cold arrived complete and serious, the kind that gets into the gaps between your collar and your jaw and reminds you that the city existed long before climate control and will exist long after. The lake went gray and hard. The streets emptied out by 8 in the evening. People moved between buildings with the particular purposefulness of those who have made peace with winter, not as a season, but as a condition. Inside the Titan Core building, the new year arrived with its own kind of weather. The Phase 1 architectural work had begun in the first week of January, contracted out to a firm Sandra had worked with at a previous company and vetted carefully over December. They came in on a Monday morning, 4 engineers with laptops and the slightly careful manner of people entering a system they haven't touched before, and Ethan spent the first 3 days working alongside them in a way that was not quite supervision and not quite collaboration, but something in between. He was the one who knew where the bodies were buried, as he'd said, and the contractors needed that knowledge before they could do anything useful. Victoria watched the first day of it from the doorway of the operations center for about 20 minutes. And what she saw was Ethan Cross standing at a whiteboard, the same kind of whiteboard she'd noticed on the 15th floor on her first morning, left with its diagrams undisturbed, drawing the routing architecture by hand while 3 contractors asked questions and took photographs of what he drew. He drew it from memory, without reference to any document, the way someone draws a map of a place they've lived for years. The contractors kept asking follow-up questions, and he kept answering them. And she could tell from the way the contractor's body language shifted over the course of that hour that they had arrived expecting a complicated legacy system and were gradually understanding that what they were dealing with was more complicated than that, and also more coherent, because one person had held it together by understanding it completely. She did not interrupt. She turned around and went back downstairs. "Joel!" The meeting with Patricia Webb happened in the second week of January. Patricia Webb was 61, a former CTO of a mid-size insurance technology company who had joined Titan Core's board 3 years ago as part of an initiative to add technical expertise to governance. She was precise and unhurried in the way of someone who had spent decades in rooms full of people talking and had learned to extract the signal from the noise. She wore her gray hair short and her glasses on her face rather than on her forehead, and she had a habit of tilting her head slightly when she was listening that made people feel more heard than they expected to. She and Ethan met in a small conference room on the 15th floor. Not the boardroom, not the operations center, just a neutral room with a table and a window. Victoria had arranged it but was not present, which she had decided was the right call for reasons she didn't fully articulate even to herself. Sandra told her afterward what had happened. They had talked for 2 hours. Patricia had asked Ethan about the documentation project first. Not the technical specifics, but the philosophy behind it. Why he had structured it as a narrative rather than a reference manual. What he believed about how institutional knowledge actually transferred between people. Ethan had apparently been more expansive on this subject than he was on most things, because it was something he'd thought about for a long time without having been asked. He told her that most organizations treat knowledge like it's stored in systems, Sandra said, when actually it's stored in people. And when the people leave or get pushed out, the knowledge goes with them. And the systems are they're like the surface. They show you what the decisions were. They don't show you why. Victoria absorbed this. She asked him what he would change, Sandra continued, if he could change one structural thing about how Titan Core operated. Not the technology, the structure. What did he say? Sandra paused. He said he'd change the way the company treated the gap between what someone's job description says and what they actually do. He said there are people in every organization doing work that's 2 or 3 levels above what they're being paid for and recognized for. And the reason it persists is that the people who would need to notice and correct it are usually focused on the people who make themselves visible. And the people doing the most critical work are often the ones who make themselves least visible because the work itself demands it. You can't watch the network and perform for an audience at the same time. Victoria sat with that for a moment. He said that, she said. More or less, Sandra said. He said it better. Patricia Webb called Victoria the morning after the meeting. He's remarkable, she said. It was not a compliment delivered with the warmth of someone discovering a talent. It had the quality of a conclusion reached through careful consideration. Not just technically. The way he thinks about systems, human systems, not just technical ones. I know, Victoria said. I want to propose something to you, and I want you to hear it as a board member and also as someone who has spent 30 years watching companies fail to use the people they have. She paused. There's a governance initiative I've been trying to get traction on for 2 years. A formal structure for identifying and elevating technical expertise that exists below the leadership visibility line. A way of institutionalizing what should happen, but doesn't, which is that the people who know the most about how a company actually functions get a voice in how it's led. Another pause. I'd like Ethan Cross to help me design it, not as a favor, as a formal advisory role, compensated, with real standing. Victoria looked out her window at the January lake. Have you asked him? I wanted to ask you first. Don't, Victoria said. A silence. Don't ask me first, she said. Ask him. It's his decision. Patricia Webb was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Yes, you're right. And something in her voice suggested she was noting this, filling it under the category of things that told her something about the person she was talking to. Ethan said yes. He said it after thinking about it for 3 days, which was how he made most decisions. Not impulsively, not after excessive deliberation, but after a period of quiet consideration that people who didn't know him sometimes mistook for reluctance. Sandra knew it wasn't reluctance. She had worked alongside him for 3 years, and she knew that the thinking time was where the actual decision happened, and that by the time he said yes or no, he had already mapped most of the consequences. He told Victoria in the operations center on a Thursday afternoon, while she was up on 17 reviewing the Phase 1 progress report with the contractors. I'm going to work with Patricia Webb on the governance initiative, he said. She looked up from the report. Good. I want to be clear about something, he said. I'm not doing it because of what happened in November. I mean, that's not the reason. I've been thinking about this problem for years. The visibility gap. The way expertise gets siloed and then lost. I've watched it happen to other people here, not just me. People who knew things nobody else knew and left and took it with them, and the company just absorbed the loss and moved on without ever understanding what it had lost. He paused. If there's a way to build a structure that makes that less likely, I want to try to build it. That's a better reason than most people bring to this kind of work, Victoria said. He looked at her for a moment, something assessing in it. You're going to say something about November again, he said. No, she said. I wasn't. He seemed to believe her, or chose to. He went back to the Phase 1 report, pointing out a section where the contractor's timeline estimate was optimistic in a way that would become a problem in Phase 2, and the conversation moved forward which was where conversations needed to go. February brought two things. The first was the completion of the monitoring reconfiguration. Sandra sent a company-wide memo on a Tuesday, brief and factual, noting that the network monitoring infrastructure had been updated and the updated system was now active. She had cleared the language of the memo with Ethan, who had made one edit. He'd removed a line that said the update would prevent future incidents of this type, because he believed that was overclaiming. Sandra had agreed with the edit and made it. The second thing February brought was the Incident Response Protocol revision. This had been the harder piece. The mandatory restart clause had been in the protocol for 11 years, and changing it required, as Victoria had known it would, sign-off from legal, from the board's technology committee, from the third-party auditors. The auditors were the most resistant. They had written the clause or contributed to writing it, and their instinct was to defend it. And there was a meeting in early February where a senior auditor named Frank DeLuca sat across a table from Victoria and Ethan and Sandra and explained at some length why the restart clause existed and why removing it created risk. Ethan let him finish. Then he said, "You're right that removing it creates risk. The question is whether the risk of removing it is larger or smaller than the risk we documented in November, when the mandatory restart was the mechanism by which a contained intrusion became an active one." Frank DeLuca looked at him. "You're proposing we replace a rule with a judgment call. I'm proposing we replace an automatic rule with a structured decision protocol. There's a difference." Ethan had brought a document, 2 pages, the decision tree he and Sandra had designed. He slid it across the table. The protocol requires a technical assessment before any restart is authorized in an active security incident. It specifies who can make the call, what information they need to make it, and what documentation is required afterward. It's not a judgment call. It's a judgment with a structure around it. Frank DeLuca read the 2 pages. The revision was approved 3 weeks later. At the board meeting where it was formally adopted, Patricia Webb said it was the most practically useful change to Titan Core's security governance in 5 years. Richard Holt noted for the record that the protocol had been developed by the infrastructure team and would credit it as such in the board minutes. Victoria, sitting at the head of the table, thought about a man asleep at a keyboard and a set of sticky notes in 3 colors, and a letter that began "Whoever finds this." She thought the letter should never have needed to exist. She thought, the fact that it exists is why this protocol now exists. Some things only get fixed after they break. That is a hard and permanent truth about institutions, about people, about the way humans learn. It doesn't mean the breaking was necessary. It means the fixing has to be real. Spring came late that year, the way it often does in Chicago. Grudgingly, with setbacks, warm days followed by cold snaps that killed the early buds. But it came. By late March, the lake had gone from gray to a steel blue that caught the light differently, and the city expanded back into its full outdoor self, and people walked the lakefront paths in the early evenings, as though reclaiming something. On a Thursday afternoon in the last week of March, Victoria was in a meeting that ran long. The quarterly operations review, which had expanded this quarter because the Phase 1 architectural work was at its midpoint, and there was a lot to cover. She came out of it at 4:30 with a legal pad full of notes and a headache that was mostly dehydration and partly the specific cognitive drain of 3 hours of technical discussion at the edge of her expertise. She took the elevator to 17. She had gotten into the habit of ending certain days on the operations floor rather than in her office. She couldn't fully explain the habit except that the operations center had a particular quality in the late afternoon. The day shift winding down, the monitors doing their clean green work, the hum of the servers that she had stopped noticing as background noise, and now heard as a kind of steady confirmation that the thing was running, the thing was working, the payments were moving and arriving, and the businesses that depended on this invisible infrastructure were getting what they needed. The room was quieter than usual when she pushed open the door. And then she heard it. Laughter. Not the restrained professional laughter of a workplace gathering. Actual laughter. It was coming from the far side of the room, near the main station, and when Victoria came around the row of workstations, she saw the source of it. Ethan was at his station, and beside him, perched on the wheeled stool that usually lived beside the secondary monitor, was Lily. She was wearing a pink jacket and had her hair in 2 uneven pigtails, uneven in the way that suggests a father who is trying his best with hair, and she had her rabbit tucked under one arm and was holding, in her other hand, what appeared to be a printout of a network diagram. She was studying it with the grave, concentrated expression of a 5-year-old who has decided that whatever this is, it is serious business. "This one," Lily said, pointing at a section of the diagram. "That's the routing junction," Ethan said. "Is that where it was broken?" "One of the places, yeah." She considered this. "Did you fix it with the screwdriver?" "No, Bug, I told you there's no screwdriver." "There should be a screwdriver," she said definitively. "Everything broken needs a screwdriver." Kevin, at the next station, made a sound that was definitely a suppressed laugh. Dale, nearby, did not suppress his. Victoria stood at the edge of the room and watched. She hadn't been noticed yet, or if she had, nobody had changed what they were doing because of it, which meant she had become, at some point in the last 4 months, a presence that didn't require performance. Lily looked up from the diagram and saw her. "Hi," she said. "Hi," Victoria said. Ethan turned. He looked at her with the brief, neutral expression he used when she appeared on the floor unexpectedly, and then something in his face relaxed. "Her school let out early. I had a phase 1 call I couldn't move." "It's fine," Victoria said. She came closer. "Lily, do you remember me?" Lily studied her with the frank, borderline rude appraisal that 5-year-olds specialize in. "You came to our apartment," she said. "I did." "Daddy was tired." "He was," Victoria said. "He'd been working very hard." Lily accepted this assessment with a nod, as if confirming something she had already known. Then she held up the network diagram. "Do you know what this is?" "Sort of," Victoria said. "Your dad understands it much better than I do." Lily looked at Ethan with the specific pride of a child who has just received confirmation that her parent is an expert in something. It was an unguarded, purely genuine look, and Ethan caught it, and something in his face did what faces do when someone who matters to you looks at you that way. Not pride exactly, more like the quiet acknowledgement of something too important for pride. "She wanted to see where I work," Ethan said. "I figured the network diagram was as good a toy as anything." "It's a very good toy," Victoria agreed seriously to Lily. Lily went back to studying the diagram with the rabbit tucked under her arm, and Victoria pulled a chair to the edge of the station and sat down, and the room went on around them. Kevin on his monitor, Dale at his station, the hum of the servers, the clean green of the dashboards, the money moving through the invisible paths that connected one business to another, carrying the ordinary commerce of ordinary days, unnoticed and essential and held together now by something sturdier than it had been 4 months ago. The governance initiative that Ethan built with Patricia Webb over those months was called, in its official documentation, the Technical Knowledge and Equity Framework. In the shorthand that people at Titan Core started using for it almost immediately, it was called the Framework, and within 6 months of its implementation, it had been adopted as a formal program. The framework had 3 components. The first was a structured process for identifying employees whose actual responsibilities and institutional knowledge exceeded their formal role in compensation, a process that didn't depend on a manager remembering to flag it, but that ran on a regular cycle and required documented evidence. Blythe Moreno's HR team administered it, and the first cycle identified 11 people at Titan Core, in roles ranging from network engineering to accounts processing to facilities management, who were carrying responsibilities that had never been formally recognized. The second component was a knowledge documentation requirement, not the comprehensive project that Ethan had undertaken, but a lighter, ongoing practice. Every team was required to identify the 2 or 3 things that only one person knew, and to begin the process of making those things known by more than one person, through documentation or cross-training or both. Sandra called this the bus factor audit, which was not the official name but became the unofficial one. The third component was what Ethan called the escalation right, a formal mechanism by which any employee could flag a concern about under-resourcing, unrecognized work, or silenced expertise directly to an oversight committee that included Patricia Webb and 2 other board members, bypassing normal management channels. It was not a grievance process, it was a signal process. It was built on the premise that the people who are doing the critical work often know things the organizational chart cannot see, and that the institution has an interest in hearing those things before they become crises. Ethan had written the documentation for all three components himself, in the same plain narrative language he used for the technical documentation. Patricia Webb had reviewed each section and made comments, and he had revised, and the back and forth of it was, Sandra told Victoria, the most substantive governance conversation she had seen happen at the board level in her 3 years at the company. She trusts him, Sandra said, not because he's deferential, because he says exactly what he means and doesn't say more than that. That's a rare thing, Victoria said. It's rarer than it should be, Sandra said. Awesome. On the day the framework was formally adopted by the board, in the third week of April, Ethan was in the boardroom for the first time. Patricia Webb had asked him to present the third component, the escalation right, himself, because she believed the board needed to hear the reasoning for it from the person who understood it most completely. He had agreed with the same 3-day thinking period he brought to most decisions. He came in a suit that looked like it had been bought recently and fit him well enough, and he stood at the head of the walnut table with the framed photographs of 7 former CEOs behind him and spoke without notes for 12 minutes about what he had observed over 8 years at this company, about what happened to knowledge that had no formal container, about the difference between a company that extracted value from its people and a company that invested in knowing what its people actually knew. He did not mention his own story directly. He didn't need to. Every person in that room had read the board minutes from November. The story was the subtext of everything he said, and the fact that he didn't lean on it, didn't use it as rhetorical leverage, made what he said more credible rather than less. Richard Holt asked one question at the end. What's the thing that would make this fail? Ethan thought about it for a moment. The same thing that makes most of these things fail, he said. If the people who benefit from things being invisible decide it's in their interest to keep them invisible, the framework only works if the people at the top actually want to know what they don't know. If they're just checking a box, it'll be useless within a year. He paused. I think this board wants to know. I think the question is whether you'll still want to know when what you learn is inconvenient. A silence in the room. Richard Holt said, Fair. The framework passed unanimously. Check. Victoria and Ethan walked out of the boardroom at the same time. The hallway was quiet, the afternoon light coming through the window at the far end in the particular slant of late April when it finally starts coming in at an angle that means something, warm rather than just bright. They walked toward the elevator without talking for a moment. The companionable silence of two people who have been through something together and don't need to narrate it. At the elevator, Victoria said, How do you feel? He considered the question with his usual seriousness. Tired, he said. Good tired. Not the other kind. There's a difference. Significant difference, he said. She looked at him. 4 months ago, she had stood in a hallway outside apartment 3C and said the words, I was wrong to a man she had met 6 hours earlier, and he had said, I know, and neither of them had known what came after that. This, apparently, was what came after. A board vote, a framework with 3 components, a documentation project with 67 completed sections and growing, a Phase 1 architectural overhaul at its midpoint, a little girl who thought everything broken needed a screwdriver. Not a resolution, exactly. Resolutions were for stories, and this was a company, and companies didn't resolve. They continued, accruing decisions and corrections and the long, undramatic work of maintaining something complex across time. But something had changed, and the change had weight, and Victoria felt it. I owe you something, she said. He looked at her. I don't mean the compensation. I mean, she stopped, finding the words. You came back, after what I did. You didn't have to. You came back and fixed it, and then you stayed and did all of this. And I know you told me it wasn't for me. It was for the businesses and the network, and it was for all of it, he said. Quietly, simply. Including this. Including what we just did in there. Why? She asked. Genuinely. He was quiet for a moment. Because the alternative is to leave, and then somewhere else has the same problem, and the only way the problem gets better anywhere is if the people who understand it stay in the room long enough to fix it. He paused. I've thought about leaving a lot of times. The last 8 years. It would have been easier in some ways. He looked at the floor. But Lily needs stability. And I know this system. I know it better than I've ever known anything professional. And there's something in that I didn't want to just walk away from, even when it wasn't being recognized. He looked up, even when I was invisible. Victoria held his gaze. You're not invisible anymore. No, he said. I'm not. He said it without triumph, just with the plain acknowledgement of something that was now true, after a long time of not being true. The elevator arrived. They rode down to the lobby in silence, and when the doors opened, they stepped out into the building's entrance hall. The marble floor, the security desk, the revolving doors leading out to the April street, and they paused in the way people pause at the end of something before they go back to their separate lives. Lily's concert was good, he said. In December, I never told you. She looked at him surprised. How was she? She stood in the back row and didn't sing a single word, he said. Just stood there very seriously for the whole thing and then clapped loudly for everyone else. He almost smiled. I was unreasonably proud of her. You should be, Victoria said. He nodded. He turned toward the door. Ethan? He stopped. She had been thinking for a moment about what to say, and then she decided not to say the polished version of it, not the version that came out clean. I walk into rooms and I see surfaces, she said. I've always done that. I see what's visible and I make decisions and I move fast. And mostly it works. And November was the first time it really didn't. And the reason it didn't was you. Not as a cautionary tale. She stopped. As the proof that what matters is almost never the thing on the surface. He looked at her for a moment. That's not a bad thing to learn, he said. Some people don't. Some people don't, she agreed. He pushed through the revolving door and walked out into the April afternoon, and she stood in the lobby and watched him go. A man in a suit that fit reasonably well, crossing toward the parking structure, carrying his canvas bag, looking like an ordinary person, which was the thing about people who held things together. They almost always looked ordinary from the outside. The extraordinary part was invisible, which was exactly the problem and exactly the thing they had spent 4 months trying to fix. She stood there for another moment. The lobby was its ordinary self, people coming and going, the security desk, the marble, the revolving doors. $600 million would move through Titan Core's network today, and most of it would arrive exactly where it was supposed to go. And the businesses on the other end would receive it without thinking about the architecture underneath, without thinking about the engineers in the operations center on the 17th floor, without thinking about a 41-page proposal or a framework with 3 components or a documentation project or a decision tree for system restarts. That was fine. That was how it was supposed to work. The people who keep the lights on don't need to be visible, but the institutions that contain them need to know they're there. Need to know their names, their expertise, what they carry that nobody else carries. Need to have built into the structure of how they operate, the habit of asking before they assume, of looking past the surface of what they see, of understanding that the person asleep at the keyboard in the early morning might be the only reason the morning is still possible. Victoria turned and walked back toward the elevator. She had work to do. Months later, on a bright afternoon in early September, she was crossing the lobby on her way back from a lunch meeting when she heard it again. Laughter. The same quality it had in the operations center in March. Unguarded. Real. She looked toward the source of it. Ethan was standing near the building's main entrance, jacket off, bag over his shoulder, clearly on his way out, and beside him doing an elaborate and apparently very important demonstration of how a rabbit hops. The stuffed rabbit, lifted and bounced across the air in precise intervals, was Lily. She had grown since January, the way children do in increments that seem sudden when you see them after a gap, and her hair was loose today, and she was explaining something to her father with the total conviction of someone who has very important information to convey. Ethan was listening. Not the listening of a distracted parent managing a child while thinking about something else. The real kind. The same quality of attention he brought to the network diagrams, to the board meeting, to everything that mattered. He was looking at his daughter and actually listening to what she said, and he laughed at something she told him. Not the performative laughter of an adult indulging a child, but the genuine kind, surprised out of him. Victoria stopped. She didn't announce herself. She just stood in the lobby for a moment and watched. She thought about something she had come to believe. Not all at once, but gradually, the way most true things arrive. that the capacity to actually listen, to hear what someone is telling you before you decide what it means, to stay in the moment of receiving information rather than rushing to the moment of acting on it, was not a soft skill. It was not a leadership style. It was the central, foundational thing, the thing that everything else depended on. She had been 30 years old and certain when she walked into Titan Corps' operations center one November morning and pointed at the door. She was not yet 31. She was not certain of very much. But she was more useful, she thought, for the uncertainty than she had been for the certainty. Because the uncertainty meant she was still asking questions, still checking whether what she saw on the surface matched what was underneath. It didn't always. That was the thing. It didn't always. Lily noticed her. She gave a small wave with the hand that was holding the rabbit, which caused the rabbit to wave also. Victoria waved back. Ethan looked over his shoulder and saw her, and he gave her the brief, uncomplicated nod of a colleague leaving for the day. And she returned it, and that was all. No ceremony, no wait, just two people in a lobby at the end of an ordinary September afternoon. Then he took Lily's hand and they walked out through the revolving doors into the late summer light, and the door turned behind them, and the lobby was quiet again. Victoria stood there for another moment. Then she took the elevator up. There was still work to do. There always was. That was the other thing. The thing nobody tells you about fixing something. It doesn't stay fixed. It requires maintenance, vigilance, the daily recommitment to the standards you've said you believe in. The monitoring has to be checked. The documentation has to be updated. The escalation rights have to be honored every single time, not just the times when honoring them is convenient. The gap between what someone's job description says and what they actually do has to be watched, because it opens back up on its own, quietly, the moment you stop paying attention. That was the work, not the crisis. The crisis was the moment everything became visible. The work was what happened after, in the ordinary days when visibility required effort, and the temptation was to let things drift back toward the surface. She knew this now in the way that you know things that have cost you something. She intended to keep knowing it.